Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Let's begin with story 1. The Hearth and the Hunt, Daily Life in a Viking Longhouse. The longhouse was not just a shelter, it was the womb of Viking winter survival. Stretching 30, sometimes even 50 feet in length, this structure stood as both a home and a fortress against the bitter Scandinavian cold. You are inside one now. It's dark, warm, and smells of wet wool, smoked meat, and fermented fish. The flickering light of the central hearth reflects off the packed earth floor. Listen. You can hear the muted shuffle of people wrapped in furs, the rustle of straw, the occasional hiss of sap from firewood. But let's begin at the beginning, construction. Before any winter could be survived, the longhouse had to be built. Constructed primarily from timber, often pine, birch, or oak cut from the surrounding forests in warmer months, the walls of these structures were supported by heavy vertical posts sunk deep into the ground. Wattle and daub or horizontal plank siding insulated the space. Roofs were steep, thatched with turf or straw, sometimes layered with sod for additional weight and insulation. Sod roofs helped keep out the wind, but they also kept in moisture. Mold was a problem, so were insects. But these were acceptable trade-offs for warmth. In winter, warmth meant everything. The hearth, positioned centrally along the longhouse's axis, was kept lit nearly all hours of the day. This wasn't just for cooking. The fire dried clothing, smoked meat, and kept water from freezing. Smoke escaped slowly through a hole in the roof, but much of it lingered in the air, creating a perpetual haze. This wasn't poor design, it was intentional. The smoke helped preserve wooden beams, kept pests at bay, and strangely, offered a kind of psychological comfort. It reminded you the fire was alive. Daily rhythms in winter were dictated by firelight and the chores of staying alive. The average Norse longhouse might have held anywhere from 10 to 25 people, including children, elderly relatives, farmhands, and often livestock. Animals, particularly goats, pigs, or even a cow, were brought inside for warmth. This blurred the line between stable and home, but it made sense in an economy of heat. Animal breath helped warm the room. Of course, this meant the house was never truly clean. The smell was a mixture of damp wool, animal dung, fermented hay, and human sweat. Lice and fleas were constant companions. Bedding, if you could call it, that was straw stuffed in linen sacks covered with animal skins. Over time, this straw had to be replaced, often with complaints. There was little privacy and few secrets. Intimacy, childbirth, prayer, illness all occurred within view or earshot of others. Survival was a shared burden. Clothing was not changed daily or even weekly. The woolen tunics and cloaks worn indoors were layered atop linen underclothes, rarely removed. Soap existed but was scarce, and usually made from animal fat and ash. Baths, when taken, were in wooden tubs using melted snow. Warmth was a privilege. Heat loss was a danger. Meals were cooked over the open hearth. A typical winter diet consisted of salted or dried fish, preserved meats, porridge made from barley or oats, and hard, black bread made during the harvest months and kept through winter. Root vegetables like turnips and onions were stored in earth cellars. These were covered with straw and accessed cautiously to avoid rot. Spoilage was common, and mold was sometimes cut off and the rest eaten anyway. Hunger softened the rules. Time was measured in chores. Mornings began with tending the fire, melting snow for water, and checking on the animals. Wood had to be chopped and brought inside, stored under benches or hung from pegs. Children gathered kindling or spun wool. Women wove and mended. Men carved or repaired tools. Sometimes in the deepest snow, even hunting was suspended. Life contracted inward. Stories were told aloud, often repeated, and always changing slightly with each telling. Oral memory was vital. These were not sagas of gods and heroes alone, but stories of ancestors, warnings of famine, and tales of neighbors long dead. The dark encouraged such remembering. The longhouse walls held many items, few of them decorative. Hooks for tools, racks for drying herbs, hanging cords for fish. Bowls were carved from wood, spoons whittled by hand. Iron nails were precious. Every item had a place, and most items had more than one use. Interestingly, longhouses often had small, intentionally placed gaps near the roof or in the walls, not for light, but for airflow. This ventilation kept carbon monoxide from building to dangerous levels. It wasn't always effective. Death by suffocation was not unheard of, but without those crude drafts, many would not have made it through the night. Despite the dreariness, the longhouse was also a place of shared resilience. Jokes were made. Songs were sung, slow, rhythmic chants to pass time or accompany labor. These songs served as both entertainment and oral archive. They were quiet, often somber, matching the monotony of the days. Still, they provided comfort. Yet as days stretched into weeks of darkness, something peculiar began to happen. A sense of stillness descended. People spoke less. Movements became slower. The mind turned inward. Sleep was frequent. Modern historians now recognize this as a kind of culturally accepted hibernation. Energy was conserved not just physically, but socially. Winter was endured, not fought. And so, within the walls of the longhouse, beneath the smoky air and next to the quiet breath of animals, Viking families survived. They wrapped themselves in layers of wool and silence, trusting in the fire and in each other. The hearth was not merely functional, it was sacred. But what happened when the fire went out? What if the wood ran low or the smoke choked more than it warmed? In the dead of winter, the fire was everything. You might think it was the walls that kept the Vikings safe from the cold, but in truth, it was the fire that stood between life and death. Without it, the longhouse became little more than a wooden box collecting frost from within. So what happened when the fire faltered? It didn't always go out suddenly. Sometimes it dimmed slowly, struggling against wet fuel or a downdraft of icy wind. Embers that should have glowed for hours smothered under damp ash. And when the hearth cooled, the entire household stirred in alarm. It meant one of two things: either wood was running low, or something was wrong with the ventilation. Either way, it required immediate attention. Gathering and managing fuel. Unlike in modern times, fuel wasn't as simple as throwing a few logs into a basket from a stockpile outside. First, you had to have a stockpile. That meant spending all of summer and fall chopping and drying wood. Wet wood, also called green wood, burned with heavy smoke and little heat. The trick was to fell trees in spring, split them into manageable logs, and store them under cover until the first frost. But even with good planning, wood might run low. Some winters were longer than others. Some years, unexpected guests or an early freeze threw off the calculations. And in a communal longhouse, consumption could rarely be predicted with accuracy. A child might add too much to the fire. Someone ill might require warmth day and night. Wood was rationed carefully, often stored under beds or hanging in bundles from beams to keep it dry. Alternative fuels were common. Dried animal dung was collected and shaped into bricks, a practice that persisted well into the early modern period in Scandinavian farming culture. It burned slow and smoky, but provided heat when nothing else was available. Peat, dug from bogs during warmer months, was another option. It burned cleanly and lasted long, but required significant effort to harvest and transport. In particularly cold months, furniture was burned. Benches, broken tools, even parts of the longhouse's own internal supports sacrificed to keep the hearth alive. It was a last resort, of course, but when faced with a choice between structural damage and freezing, the decision wasn't hard. Heat zones and sleeping arrangements. When the fire was strong, the house was divided into invisible heat zones. Those closest to the fire, the sick, the elderly, infants, were layered in the warmest clothing and placed near the hearth. Others slept at varying distances, wrapped in furs. The walls, packed with turf and mud, helped retain some heat. But by morning, ice would still collect in the corners, frost forming on blankets and clothing. At night, embers were banked. This meant piling ash over the coals to preserve heat without open flame. In the morning, a careful hand would stir the embers, add kindling, and hope the fire caught again. If it didn't, it meant starting from scratch with flint and steel, or, if fortunate, a tinderbox. Failure wasn't just inconvenient, it could cost fingers. Frostbite in survival medicine. The Viking Age lacked our modern understanding of frostbite, but its symptoms were well known. Numb toes, fingers that turned white then black, ears that cracked and bled. The response was practical, not scientific. Warming frozen limbs in cold water rather than hot was one technique known to avoid shock. Rubbing with snow, while common in modern myths, was actually avoided. It worsened tissue damage. Instead, warmth was administered slowly. A foot might be tucked against another person's stomach. Fingers might be cupped under an armpit. Human warmth was more effective than fire for treating frostbite, though less convenient. Herbs were used too. Yarrow, angelica, and juniper were among the few native plants known to have antiseptic or warming properties, though availability in winter was scarce. Dried herbs, gathered in autumn, might be boiled into a tea or poultice. Honey was applied to open sores. Animal fat, goose or bear, if available, was used to coat skin, creating a crude barrier against the cold. Still, frostbite often led to infection, and infection to death. A simple frozen toe could become a festering wound. Amputation, when performed, was crude if attempted at all. Most survived or didn't. The line between recovery and loss was thin. Food preservation and winter rations. Without consistent heat, there was no fresh cooking. The loss of fire meant cold porridge, stale bread, and salted fish. Meals became mechanical, not pleasurable. Cold stiffened everything, including spirits, but the Vikings were nothing if not pragmatic. Food was prepared for winter long before the first snow. Drying and salting were the main methods. Fish, especially cod and herring, were caught in great numbers, cleaned, then hung on racks to dry in the wind. Salted fish would keep for months, as would smoked meat. Grains were stored in woven sacks in raised storage huts, away from moisture and pests. Turnips, onions, and leeks were buried in root cellars, shallow underground pits lined with straw and covered with wooden planks. These kept cool, but not freezing, and allowed for gradual use. Fermentation was also key. Cabbage and root vegetables were often preserved through lactofermentation. The result was sour, salty, and pungent, but packed with nutrients. Sauerkraut, a dish many associate with later German cuisine, had early Norse counterparts. These preserved foods were eaten in small amounts, often alongside porridge made with water, barley, and sometimes dried berries or honey. When food ran low, meals became symbolic. Bread might be sliced thinner, stews watered down. The winter rationing was brutal but fair. Each member of the household ate according to age, strength, and need. And in many homes, the communal pot ensured everyone had at least a taste of something warm when the fire allowed. The psychological weight of cold. Beyond the physical toll, winter wore on the mind. Daylight was brief. In the northernmost settlements, the sun disappeared entirely for weeks at a time. Darkness wasn't just a backdrop, it was an element of daily life. People moved more slowly. Speech became rare. Even tasks were done in silence. Modern historians now use the term seasonal affective disorder to describe what these communities faced. But the Vikings understood it without numbing it. They combated it with ritual, with stories, and with sleep. Long periods of rest, even hibernation-like patterns, were observed. People slept more, worked less, and accepted lethargy as a seasonal burden. The gods were invoked, but not always to intervene. Winter was not an enemy to be defeated. It was an ordeal to endure. Even the gods in Norse mythology had to brave Fimbulwinter, a mythic long winter that would precede Ragnarök. In this sense, suffering was part of the divine order. And when the fire went out, if the fire died completely and no flint or embers remained, someone had to seek help. This was not an easy task. A neighbor's farm might be half a day's walk away through snow-covered forests. The path would be hard to follow. Wolves and bears were rare threats, but real ones. Frostbite would begin within an hour of exposure if winds were strong. Even layered in wool and fur, the traveler would risk their life. But if successful, they would return with a lit torch, cradled carefully, protected from wind. This small flame would be relit in the hearth, the fire reignited, and the house would exhale again. There was often celebration after such an event. The fire meant life resumed. Yet not every journey succeeded. Some froze in the woods, a few meters from help. Others never returned at all. And those left behind waited, staring into the cold ashes, wondering if the silence outside would bring fire or news of death. This was the reality of winter. It was not heroic, but it was deeply human. Survival meant mastering 100 small tasks, not one great act. It meant knowing which wood burned slowest, how to wrap a child in straw, how to ration fat and store onions and mend a roof with frozen hands. But in every quiet longhouse, one question echoed louder than the rest. What happened when the hunters didn't return from the snow? The fire flickers and the wind howls through the seams of the sod roof. Inside, you wait. The hunters left 2 days ago, silent men with thick beards, axes at their hips, bows strung across their backs. Their footprints vanished under a heavy snowfall. You've counted meals. There's enough porridge for another 3 days if everyone eats sparingly. The salted fish is nearly gone. The mood has shifted. This is the part of Viking winter life often left untold. What happens not just when the fire dims, but when those who go out to secure survival simply don't return. The hunter's role in winter. Winter hunting was never ideal. The Norse preferred to slaughter most livestock before the snows to avoid feeding them through the winter. Only breeding stock, perhaps one cow, a few goats, and some hardy sheep were kept alive, fed meagerly on dried hay and stored root vegetables. This left a gap in protein that needed to be filled. That gap was filled by the hunter. During the short days of late autumn, game was still abundant: reindeer, elk, and smaller creatures like hare and ptarmigan. But as winter deepened, these animals migrated or grew scarce. Tracks became harder to find. Meat had to be earned with time, effort, and exposure. The typical Viking hunter was not a heroic figure clad in shining gear. He was often an aging farmer, a skilled trapper, or a son with strong legs and a keen eye. He used skis, early versions carved from ash or birch, or snowshoes to traverse drifts. His clothing was layered with wool, sometimes lined with fur and waterproofed with fish oil. Weapons were simple: a bow, arrows tipped with iron or bone, a knife, and sometimes a short spear. More than anything, the hunter carried knowledge: where the game trails were likely to run, where rabbits nested under snowdrifts, how to read wind and sky and silence. In winter, silence spoke volumes. Animal tracks and traps. Snow made movement difficult but observation easier. A single set of tracks could lead a hunter to a fox den or a buried snare. Snares, small loops made from animal gut or twisted bark fiber, were set in known animal paths. Pit traps, lined with sharpened stakes and covered in snow, were sometimes used for larger animals, though risky. Meat was not the only goal. Pelts were essential for warmth and trade. The hide of a single fox could be bartered for honey, herbs, or iron tools come spring. Mink, squirrel, and even otter were prized for their dense winter coats. The skinning process was meticulous. Mistakes rendered pelts worthless. Hunters carried small knives specifically for this task, their blades worn smooth from sharpening. Sometimes they returned with less than hoped: a rabbit or two, sometimes nothing. And sometimes they did not return at all. Waiting for the hunters. The silence that follows a missing hunter is heavy. In a longhouse, the absence is felt in the routine: the empty sleeping space, the untouched bowl, the tools left hanging. Children whisper questions. Adults give non-answers. Often, a second party would not be sent unless absolutely necessary. Lives were not wagered easily. After 3 days, maybe 4, a decision would be made. Wait longer or send another. Could they afford the loss? If the decision was made to send a searcher, it was usually someone young and quick. They would follow the last known route, look for broken branches, blood in the snow, or signs of a struggle with a boar or bear. A snapped bowstring, a trail that ended too abruptly. In many cases, nothing was found. But there were victories too. Hunters who returned frostbitten but smiling, dragging sleds heavy with elk meat. Celebrations were muted, no feasting, just a warm pot, shared meat, and murmured thanks. In a world where death was never far, every survival felt like a quiet miracle. Spiritual comfort and rituals. To face the endless winter, people turned not only to fire and food, but to faith. The gods of the Norse pantheon were not forgiving. Odin, the one-eyed wanderer, brought wisdom but demanded sacrifice. Thor protected humanity but battled constantly with giants of ice and chaos. Winter was seen not just as a season, but as a living force, a trial given form. Small household rituals were common. A sliver of bread left by the hearth, a whispered prayer before leaving for a hunt, carved runes tied with sinew, worn as charms around the neck. Not for luck, Vikings believed in fate, but for strength and clarity. The blot, a winter sacrifice, was a communal act, but small private offerings happened too. Sometimes a prized pelt would be burned, or a bowl of broth left untouched, placed outside for spirits of the ancestors. These were not idle superstitions. They were psychological tools for enduring the unendurable. Sagas later written down often omitted these quieter acts, but archaeological evidence from household altars to burned offerings in middens suggests they were vital parts of winter life. Return of the light. Eventually, the days began to stretch. First by minutes, then by noticeable change. The sun sat higher in the sky. Snow started to drip from the eaves. Birds returned. Life slowly emerged from frost. In the longhouse, everything shifted. Heavy blankets were aired outside. Wooden tools repaired. Traps reset. People moved more. Laughter returned. The silence softened. For the Vikings, spring was not just a season, it was a resurrection. It meant the beginning of fishing, planting, building, and once again engaging with the outside world. Trade resumed. Neighbors visited. Boats were repaired. But the memories of winter lingered, scars from frostbite, names not spoken anymore. The ash circle in the hearth, swept clean but always there. Spring was a gift paid for with vigilance. And while sagas tell of battlefields and gods, the real heroism of the Viking Age lay in this. Ordinary people, surviving unthinkable cold through cooperation, stubbornness, and the careful management of almost nothing. Their world was not glorious. It was hard, small, and deeply communal. Fires were not symbols, they were tools. Meals were not feasts, they were calculations. And survival was not triumph, it was quiet, persistent resilience. So as you imagine the snow melting outside that longhouse door, ask yourself, what did the Vikings dream about when spring finally came? Story 2. How to tan a deer hide by hand, the cold work of fur preparation. It's winter. A fresh deer carcass lies in the snow outside your longhouse, steam rising faintly from its opened belly. The hunt was successful, a quiet arrow through the lung, a clean trail of red across white ground. The meat will be eaten, yes, but the hide, that's your job now. Because in the world of the Vikings, warmth is survival and fur is currency. To make fur useful, it must first be transformed. The process is long, tedious, and foul-smelling. But without it, skins rot, stiffen, and attract vermin. The tanning of hides, especially in winter, is one of the most unglamorous yet vital skills of the Norse world. Let us walk through it, step by painstaking step. Skinning the animal, the first cut. Once the deer is brought to the longhouse or nearby work shed, the first task is to skin it quickly, before the flesh freezes and makes removal more difficult. A sharp knife, made of iron or occasionally bone, is used to make a cut from neck to tail. The goal is to separate the hide cleanly without slicing into it, which would reduce its value and integrity. The skin comes off with steady pulling and careful cutting along muscle and tendon. It is then stretched, fur side down, onto a flat surface, snow-covered stone, wooden board, or even directly onto a trampled patch of ground. At this stage, the hide is heavy with flesh and blood. It's warm to the touch but will begin to freeze quickly in the open air. The next step must be done before that happens. Fleshing, a knife in the cold. Fleshing a hide means removing every scrap of meat, fat, and sinew clinging to the skin's underside. This is crucial. Leftover tissue will rot or attract insects once the hide is stored. The tool used is a curved fleshing knife or a flat stone blade. Vikings likely used both, depending on their region and material access. The blade is worked in careful strokes, pushing tissue away from the hide. This takes hours. The work is done bent over, sometimes kneeling in snow, hands numb despite gloves of wool or leather. Fat cakes under fingernails. Blood stains the wrists. Fleshing is unpleasant but satisfying. A clean hide feels smooth, almost rubbery. Some Viking women were known for their skill in this task, passing the technique down through generations. Clean hides brought status. Dirty ones brought mold. Once fleshed, the hide is rinsed if possible in icy water to remove blood and lingering fat. If water is scarce or frozen, snow may be used as an abrasive cleanser. The hide is then left to freeze overnight, stiffening into a board. This is not a mistake. It helps with the next step. Hair removal. Not all fur is wanted. While some hides are preserved with the fur intact, like fox, marten, or bear, others are tanned hairless to make soft leather. Deer hide is often treated this way. To remove the hair, the frozen hide is thawed and soaked in an alkaline solution, wood ash and water, or old urine. Yes, urine. Stale human urine contains ammonia, which breaks down the bonds holding hair follicles to skin. In Viking times, urine was collected in buckets over several days, often kept near the hearth to prevent freezing. This was not considered odd. It was simply part of the household economy. The hide is soaked in this mixture for a day or more, then pulled out and scraped again. Hair comes off in clumps, slewing away like wet grass. The smell is pungent, sour, sharp, and eye-watering but effective. Once dehaired, the hide is rinsed thoroughly in cold water, preferably running water from a stream. In the deepest winter, holes are hacked through ice to allow rinsing. If not rinsed well, the chemicals will continue to break down the hide during storage. The result is a pale, soft, nearly translucent sheet of rawhide, supple but fragile. Now comes the transformation. Brain tanning, a peculiar but proven process. Here is one of the more bizarre facts of pre-modern tanning. Every animal has enough brain matter to tan its own hide. Vikings knew this. Once the hide was rinsed and clean, it was ready to be tanned, and that meant applying brain mush. The animal's brain, boiled gently and mashed into a thick paste with warm water, was rubbed into the hide, soaking it thoroughly. The brain's oils and enzymes help break down tough collagen and replace it with a supple, workable texture. The hide is folded, kneaded, stretched, and twisted to work the oils deep into the fibers. This takes hours, sometimes a full day. The smell is organic, earthy, and metallic. In some communities, fish oil or bear fat was used instead, but brain tanning remained common due to its convenience. If a brain wasn't available, others could be used: pig, fish, or even human in extreme folklore, though there's no reliable evidence of the last ever being practiced. After the hide is fully saturated with brain mixture, it is wrung out and left to partially dry. But if it dries completely without stretching, it will become hard and unusable. Therefore, as it dries, the tanner works it, constantly pulling it across wooden posts, rubbing it between hands, or tugging it in all directions to keep the fibers flexible. This part of the process is physically demanding. Shoulders ache, fingers split. In cold weather, drying takes longer, giving more time to work the hide but also increasing the risk of freezing. The tanner must monitor temperature and humidity carefully. It is, in essence, a race between flexibility and frost. Smoking the hide, the final transformation. Once the hide is soft and dry, the final step begins, smoking. This is done not for warmth, but for chemical preservation. Smoke alters the pH of the hide and introduces antimicrobial compounds. It also imparts the characteristic tan or yellow color we associate with buckskin. A small, low fire is built with rotten wood, moss, or punky logs, materials that smolder rather than burn cleanly. The hide is stitched into a loose sack or tube and suspended above the fire, allowing smoke to fill its interior. This is done slowly over several hours. Too fast and the hide stiffens. Too slow and it molds. Smoke smells cling to the skin for days, but the end result is worth it. A durable, water-resistant, supple leather that can be used for clothing, moccasins, pouches, or armor. A well-smoked hide will last for years. In fact, some of the oldest Viking garments discovered in bogs and burial sites show evidence of smoke tanning, a testament to the process's longevity. And so, by firelight and frost, using brains and bark and bone knives, the Vikings turned raw hides into the garments that would shield them from Arctic winds. It was not glamorous, it was not fast, but it was survival. Still, one part remains. The hide may be tanned, but what now? What did the Vikings do with these skins once prepared? Were they all worn, or was there more to this trade than warmth alone? The hide is now soft, pliable, and fragrant with the scent of smoke and effort. After hours, perhaps days of scraping, soaking, and stretching, you finally hold a material that won't rot, crack, or turn to stone in the frost. But tanning is only half the story. Now the hide must be transformed into something of use. In the Viking world, leather was more than a necessity. It was a sign of skill, status, and trade. Whether worn on the back of a chieftain or traded across the Baltic Sea, these tanned skins played a quiet but crucial role in shaping the Norse economy and identity. Clothing, protection against the north wind. While wool was the primary textile of Viking garments, leather served as armor against the worst elements. Once a hide was tanned, it was cut using iron shears when available or flint knives shaped for fabric work. Patterns were simple, rectangles and triangles, designed to reduce waste and maximize warmth. Leather tunics, aprons, and leggings were common among laborers and travelers. Unlike woven cloth, leather repelled wind and moisture. It didn't fray or require hemming. Boots made of soft hide, often lined with wool or fur, were tied with leather cords or laces cut from thinner hides. Waterproofing was done with tallow or fish oil, rubbed in with fingers until the leather darkened and grew slick. Children's clothing included small mittens, foot wraps, and even capes fashioned from stitched-together scraps. These were worn over woolen underlayers, not only for insulation, but also because cured leather could chafe bare skin in the cold. Leather was also a material of repair. Torn sails were patched with leather. Punctured buckets were sealed with hide. Even weapons such as axe handles or bow grips were wrapped in leather for better control and endurance in wet conditions. In winter, when cloth could freeze stiff from snowmelt and breath, leather remained flexible. It was, in many ways, the ultimate winter fabric. Trade, skins as Viking currency. To understand the value of a single tanned deer hide, you must understand the Norse trade network. Vikings are often remembered as raiders, but they were equally merchants. Their ships traveled along rivers and coastlines, linking them to the British Isles, the Frankish kingdoms, the Baltic states, and as far east as Byzantium and the Arab world. Furs and hides were among the most commonly traded commodities. Archaeological finds at sites like Hedeby and Birka, two major Viking trading centers, reveal stockpiles of prepared skins. These were not just goods, they were currency. A fine hide, especially from deer, fox, or bear, could be exchanged for grain, tools, honey, iron, or even silver. Some were traded whole, others were cut into standard-sized pieces, early proto-money. Ruse traders, Norsemen based along the rivers of what is now Russia and Ukraine, became especially known for exporting high-quality furs to the east. Sable and beaver were luxury items. Viking fur-clad traders were welcomed in the marketplaces of Baghdad, where Norse leatherwork was prized for its durability and earthy, smoked scent. Even taxes were paid in hides. In some regions of Scandinavia, it was common for tenant farmers to offer a certain number of tan pelts per year to their overlords or local chieftains. A failure to provide could mean loss of land or status. Tanning was, quite literally, a survival skill not just for warmth, but for economic standing. Craft and utility, everyday leatherwork. Beyond clothing and trade, leather was everywhere in Viking daily life. Belts, thick leather belts held tools, knives, and pouches. Some were plain, others stamped with simple designs using bone or antler presses. Straps and bindings. Sleds, skis, and packs used leather straps for flexibility and strength. Book binding. Early Christian texts brought from Europe were bound in leather. Monks at Viking-age monasteries used local hides to protect vellum pages. Drinking vessels. Some flasks and cups were fashioned from hardened leather, treated with beeswax to hold liquids. Scabbards and sheaths. Every knife and axe had its own leather casing, protecting both the blade and the wearer. Containers. Leather bags stored everything from herbs and salt to bone tools and personal tokens. Tools for leatherwork were simple but refined. Awls made from antler or iron poked holes. Bone needles threaded sinew or plant fiber to stitch seams. Vikings favored a looping overcast stitch, tight and durable, ensuring garments held together even under heavy use. Leather was often left plain, but not always. Some hides were dyed with crushed berries or bark mixtures. Others were decorated with tooled patterns, lines, knots, or simple depictions of animals. These marks didn't indicate status so much as personality. A fisherman might stamp a wave pattern into his pouch. A hunter might mark his moccasins with elk hooves. In this way, leather became not just functional but expressive. Winter storage and hide rot. Even a well-tanned hide could rot in the wrong conditions. To preserve their value, unused hides were rolled tightly and hung from rafters, away from damp ground and rodents. Smoke helped deter insects, but mold remained a threat, especially in longhouses crowded with animals and people. Some families kept leather in sealed clay vessels, lined with straw. Others buried them under dry moss or stored them in elevated granaries. Tanned hides were sometimes layered between slabs of dried peat, another use for the ever-present fuel of winter. Still, not all hides survived. A warm winter or poorly dried hide could sour, becoming brittle or foul. When this happened, the entire household felt it. It meant one fewer pair of boots, one less trade item, one missed opportunity for survival. The work was unforgiving, but then so was the world. Rituals and symbolism. Though practical in use, leather and hide held ritual importance too. Animal skins were sometimes used in ceremonies. A newly hunted bear, believed to hold spiritual power, might have its pelt laid at the feet of a god statue or draped over a ritual mound. Deer hides were used in winter blot sacrifices to deities for a good hunt or safe thaw. In some burial sites, leather wrappings were found around the feet or hands of the dead, likely for protection in the afterlife. Others were buried with full leather garments, preserved remarkably in peat bogs that froze the process of decay. Skins told stories. A hunter might wear a cloak made from the pelts of animals he'd killed himself, less a trophy than a personal saga stitched into fabric. Some believed that the spirit of the animal stayed with the hide, offering protection or guidance in dreams. Others simply knew that a warm coat meant waking up alive. Tanning was hard work, cold work, work of patience, precision, and pungent smells, but it was also a foundation, a quiet, repetitive labor that made everything else possible. Still, leather wore out, skins tore, boots split, clothes aged, and eventually everything had to be redone. Every winter brought more deer, more hides, more smoke, more hands cracked from cold and lie. But when the skins were gone, what came next? What did the Vikings do when the animals were no longer enough? When the winter grew longer than the hides could cover? It is late winter now. The winds no longer howl, but the snow still lies deep. You've tanned your last hide. The drying racks stand empty. The larders are low. There hasn't been fresh game in 2 weeks, and your last pair of boots split across the toe. The children's mittens are patched with scrap. A cowhide, once the floor mat, is now being cut into strips for repairs. This was the other side of tanning. What happened when there were no more skins to tan? Even in the best prepared Viking households, winters brought shortages. Hides could only last so long, and when animal sources dwindled, the Norse turned not to conquest, but to creativity. Worn leather and the culture of repair. First came repair. Vikings were masters of mending. Leather was patched again and again, stitched with sinew or linen thread, reinforced with plant fibers, and even soaked in water and hammered flat to reform it. Cracks were softened with tallow. Tears were sewn with looped stitching techniques, layering patches over elbows, knees, and boot soles. Belts, sandals, and gloves were reinforced with bone splints, or wrapped with twine when the hide itself thinned beyond use. Leather cords were braided and rebraided, turned into new bindings, laces, or even hinges for small boxes. Nothing was thrown away lightly. A boot worn by a father might become a child's soul. A torn glove might be cut down for a pouch. Even scrap leather, thin and brittle, was boiled down into glue or used to bind tools. Recycling wasn't ideology. It was survival. Substitutes for animal skins. In regions where deer, elk, or seal were scarce, or in winters when hunting had failed, other materials stood in for leather. These substitutes were imperfect, but they extended life and provided vital cover. Fish skin leather. Perhaps surprisingly, fish skin could be tanned into a usable leather. Salmon and cod were most common. The skin was scaled, scraped, soaked, and oiled to produce thin, flexible strips used for gloves, pouches, or inner linings. While not as durable as mammal hide, fish leather was water-resistant and surprisingly strong when layered. Tree bark textiles. Some communities in Scandinavia developed bark cloth made by pounding the inner bark of trees like linden or birch into sheets. Though stiff and prone to cracking, bark cloth was used for aprons, outer wraps, and shoe linings. These were sometimes softened with animal fat or used in conjunction with fur scraps. Wool felt. In times of hide scarcity, wool became more heavily relied upon. Felting, the process of matting wool fibers with moisture and friction, produced dense, wind-resistant fabrics. Though not as tough as leather, felted wool was warm, flexible, and could be made at home. Textile reinforcement. Cloth garments were reinforced with bone buttons, leather cords, or strips of bark to withstand heavy wear. A linen tunic with bark cloth elbow patches or fish leather cuffs was not uncommon in resource-strained communities. These were not glamorous solutions. They were rough, itchy, and often temporary, but they bought time enough perhaps to see the thaw. Fur and class, who had what? Even in a world defined by survival, inequality shaped access. Not everyone wore fox or marten. These luxurious pelts were symbols of status, worn by chieftains, wealthy merchants, or jarls. The finest furs, especially sable, otter, and beaver, were often exported for silver, not worn locally. Poorer families wore sheepskin or patched together garments of mixed origin, a sleeve of wolf, a collar of dog, a hood lined with rabbit. Some wore no fur at all, relying on layers of wool and felt. Children might go without boots indoors. Infants were wrapped in straw-filled sacks, bound with linen and placed near the hearth. This wasn't cruelty, it was triage. In hard winters, clothing was redistributed according to need. A strong son preparing to hunt might take a father's best cloak. An elder might give up their outerwear to protect a grandchild. These were not sentimental choices, but deeply practical ones. Survival came before ownership. Cultural responses to scarcity. As with every hardship, scarcity bred ritual. During harsh winters, communities often held quiet rites of preservation. These were not large ceremonies, but small, symbolic acts. Burning a single pelt as an offering for spring, sacrificing a goat's skin in hopes of luck, or fasting from meat for a day to honor the spirits of the animals already taken. Some sagas refer to kaldblot cold offerings performed during deep winter, often involving hides, antlers, or tan scraps laid at burial mounds or tied to sacred trees. These acts were both spiritual and social, reminders of balance and humility in a landscape that showed little mercy. Fur, like fire, was sacred because it kept the soul inside the body. Thaw and rebirth. When spring finally came, it brought more than sun. It brought movement. Traders arrived from southern villages. The forests awakened. River ice cracked and shifted. Game returned to the high trails. And with them the process began again. The hunt, the skinning, the stretching and scraping, the soaking and smoking. Old tools were oiled, new needles carved. Sometimes old hides were pulled from rafters, forgotten pieces curled and brittle. They were soaked, softened, worked back into form. The smell of brain paste returned to the air, mingled with early blossoms. And as the longhouse door was thrown open, you could see the patchwork of winter, the garments of survival. Not matching, not elegant, but whole. Each stitch told a story, of an animal brought down in snow, of a child carried on a mother back, of fingers rubbed raw scraping sinew from frozen flesh, of warmth earned not given. The deer hide, once soft and supple, now worn and darkened, bore the creases of months spent in motion. It had lived a second life, one of service, protection, and quiet, daily sacrifice. So when the hides ran out, the Vikings didn't despair. They mended, adapted, and waited for the next thaw. They covered themselves in scraps and spirit, in invention and memory. They survived. And as spring winds scattered the last drifts of snow, one couldn't help but wonder. How many winters did it take before a single coat was passed from grandfather to grandson, and how many more before it finally fell apart? Story 3. Winter trade routes, sleds, skis, and salted fish. The Viking world was not still, even in winter. Snow fell, rivers froze, winds howled, but life and trade continued. Imagine yourself standing atop a snow-drifted ridge in coastal Norway. Before you, a narrow trail, worn flat by sled runners and the slow drag of skis. Beyond, miles of forest, ice, and silence. But these paths are not random. They are roads, ancient winter trade routes etched by need and maintained by tradition. Along these invisible highways, goods flowed like lifeblood between scattered communities, and even the deepest snow could not stop them. The image of Vikings as sea raiders is well known. Less appreciated is their inland connectivity during winter, when boats were frozen in harbors and roads vanished under snow. This is the story of how salted fish, oiled skins, mead, and even iron crossed hundreds of miles, not by ship, but by sled and ski, pulled by muscle, animals, and a great deal of stubbornness. Why trade in winter? It may seem strange to you. Why not wait until spring? In truth, winter offered advantages for trade, especially in the far north. Frozen rivers became solid highways. What was a slow rowing route in summer became a smooth glide for sleds. Marshes and bogs, impassable in warmer months, froze solid, allowing direct passage. Forests, thick with undergrowth in summer, became navigable corridors under snow. Goods like salted fish, meat, and skins were easier to transport in the cold. They didn't spoil. People, largely confined indoors during winter, needed news, materials, and food. Trade wasn't a luxury, it was a lifeline. For isolated settlements, a winter trader was more than a merchant. He brought salt, soapstone, wool, dried herbs, beeswax, and stories from afar. In return, he took away furs, fermented fish, tanned hides, and sometimes reluctantly a few coins or jewelry pieces. Trade didn't stop for snow, it adapted to it. The sled, beast, and burden. Sleds were the cornerstone of Viking winter transport. Simple in construction, often made of ash or pine, they were built to glide across packed snow or ice. There were different kinds. Hand-pulled sleds, for short distances or light loads, especially common in local trade or by farmers hauling goods between farms. Animal-drawn sleds, larger sleds pulled by oxen, dogs, or where domesticated reindeer or horses. These carried heavier goods, including barrels of dried fish, bags of grain, or bundles of fur. Flat drag sleds, pulks, used in mountainous terrain, these had curved fronts to avoid digging into snow and were favored by hunters and messengers. Sled construction mattered. Runners were often greased with animal fat or pine tar to reduce friction. In some cases, fish oil was used, producing a distinctive, sour scent on the trail. The bindings, leather thongs, or rope secured loads tightly. Even the smallest shift in weight could tip a sled or damage cargo. Sledders learned to read snow like a sailor reads water. Crusty top layers meant faster gliding. Powder snow slowed movement and risked sinking. Ice over hidden water posed a deadly hazard. A wrong step could break the surface and doom man and animal alike. Travel was slow. Most winter caravans moved between 10-20 kilometers per day, depending on terrain. Rest stops were dug into snowbanks or found in way stations, small shelters left stocked by local farmers. Fires were rare on the trail due to wind and risk of melting the snow beneath, which could collapse the surface. But the trade kept moving, mile by frozen mile. Skis, the silent glide. If the sled was the beast of burden, skis were the boots of the North. The Norse were among the earliest and most consistent users of skis for long-distance travel. The word ski itself comes from Old Norse skith, meaning a split piece of wood. Viking-age skis, found in bogs and burial sites, were typically about 5-7 feet long, narrow, and slightly upturned at the front. They were strapped to the feet with leather bindings and used with a single long pole. Skiers were scouts, messengers, and light traders. In deep winter, when sleds were impractical or routes too narrow, skis allowed swift movement across ice fields and forest glades. Speed wasn't their only virtue. Silence mattered too. Skis made less noise than sleds and thus became the favored tool of hunters or those avoiding attention. Some skis were waxed with beeswax or resin to enhance glide. Others were rough, designed for grip in icy conditions. In especially cold regions like Lapland, skis were essential. No one walked through the snow. You glided or you sank. Skiing wasn't easy. It demanded balance, strength, and patience. But for the Viking trader gliding over the frozen lake, the alternative post-holing through chest-deep drifts was worse. What was traded in winter? While many goods were moved in warmer seasons, several products were uniquely suited to winter. Salted fish, especially stockfish, unsalted dried cod, which was durable, lightweight, and a key trade commodity from Norway to the Baltic. Tanned hides and furs, already cured and smoked, these traveled best in cold weather, avoiding rot. Beeswax, used for candles and preservation, kept solid in the cold. Mead and ale, transported in tightly sealed wooden barrels or leather skins, kept from freezing by being buried in snow or packed in straw. Soapstone and iron, tools, ingots, or cookware made of soapstone, a soft, heat-resistant stone from quarries in Norway and Sweden, were valuable winter items. Spices and herbs. Dried wild herbs like yarrow or juniper were traded for medicinal use. There were also less tangible exchanges: news, gossip, rumors of kings, or omens of coming war. These carried value. A trader who brought a new tune or tale might be fed better than one with nothing but goods. And there were darker trades too. Enslaved persons, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals, sometimes moved in secrecy during winter months when oversight was minimal. These human commodities, though less common, were a grim but real part of certain trade routes. Way stations and shelters. Along major inland routes, simple way stations existed. These were known by various names but all served the same function: temporary shelter. Some were built by local landowners to support trade, others were shared community assets. These huts, little more than timber lean-tos, were stocked with dry wood, a pot, maybe dried moss or straw for bedding. In some cases, communal storage pits nearby held emergency grain or dried fish, protected by stone slabs and guarded by communal trust. Travelers repaid the favor by leaving firewood, sealing gaps, or writing messages in charcoal on the walls. Frozen river ahead, wolf tracks yesterday, blessing from Thor. These structures saved lives. Trade in winter was slow, cold, and dangerous, but it was vital. Without it, isolated communities would wither. With it, they endured. And as men pushed sleds over snowdrifts, balanced on skis across frozen lakes, and whispered news into frostbitten ears, they carried not just goods but hope. Still, these routes were never guaranteed. Paths shifted, rivers cracked, and sometimes traders vanished into white silence, never to be seen again. Which leads us to a question whispered at every way station, under every frozen sky. What happened when the snow swallowed the trade? When winter closed in so tightly, even the ice roads broke beneath their feet. The sled groans under its weight. The sky is heavy with gray snow, and the wind whispers a warning you've heard before. Still, you press forward. You have salted fish from the coast, iron tools from a forge 3 valleys away, and a small pouch of pine resin for a midwife in a village you may or may not reach before dark. The snow is deeper than expected. The river ahead looks solid, but the ice might be thin. You've tied your goods tight, wrapped your boots with extra twine, and kept your blades near the fire overnight to prevent frost brittling. But deep down, you know, one crack, one storm, one wrong step, and winter might not let you go. Because while Viking winter trade routes offered promise, they also offered peril. The fragility of frozen roads. The greatest threat to any winter traveler wasn't wolves or even starvation. It was the terrain itself, an ever-shifting world of snow, ice, and wind. Frozen rivers and lakes used as smooth sled highways could betray even experienced traders. A sudden thaw, driven by warm ocean air currents or unexpected sunlight, weakened ice layers. What looked like solid footing might be only a crust over freezing water. Signs of danger were subtle. Hollow echoes under sled runners. Unusual whiteness in the ice, called candled ice. Hairline cracks spidering out like runes underfoot. But sometimes there were no signs at all. A sled would break through, vanishing in a blink. The man would scramble for shore if lucky, or be pulled under by wet wool and weighted cargo. To prevent this, travelers used long poles to probe the ice ahead. Some tied ropes around their waists, the other end looped through the sled. Hopping the cargo could help pull them free. And some chose to travel only at night when the ice refroze solid after the day's sun. Yet even then, nothing was certain. Whiteout and disorientation. Blizzards and sudden snowfall posed another danger. When a whiteout hit, usually without warning, landmarks disappeared. The world became a blank scroll, trees blurred into sky. The wind erased trails behind you. You could wander in circles for hours, never realizing you turned. Experienced traders countered this with sound and texture. They listened for river ice cracking beneath snow, or the rustle of birch trees versus spruce. They learned the feel of paths underfoot, the firmness of packed sled tracks, the softness of drifted powder. But these were not foolproof. Some carried talismans, carved runes or charms of bone, meant to protect against Fjelvid, a concept of mountain wisdom and the spirits of the highlands. In sagas and folklore, travelers who disappeared in winter were often said to have angered local Vidir, land spirits, or ventured into places they didn't belong. In more grounded truth, they likely walked off course, lay down to rest, and never rose again. The snow did not need to kill quickly, it simply needed to wait. The disappeared. Stories abound of vanished traders, real or legendary. At a crossing near present-day Hedmark, an old tale speaks of a trader named Alvir who vanished en route to the coast. His sled was found months later, caught in tree roots, stripped of all goods. His leather boots, still upright, stood in snow beside it. His body was never recovered. Another account, found in 13th century Icelandic annals, describes a group of 6 men from Husavik who attempted a midwinter crossing to trade wool for iron. A storm struck. Only one returned, mute and frostbitten. His hair turned white. He lived another 10 years and never spoke again. These stories may be embellished, but their core is true. Winter travel was not guaranteed. It was an act of bravery, stubbornness, and blind faith in the road ahead. The ethics of winter trade. With danger came questions of responsibility. What did a trader owe his family, his community, himself? Some longhouses forbade winter travel beyond a certain distance. Others encouraged it, especially if resources were running low. In some places, trade journeys were decided communally, drawing lots or assigning tasks based on strength, experience, or age. A young man eager to prove himself might volunteer. An elder might go, believing he had fewer winters left to risk. In either case, the choice was rarely selfish. Goods were not traded for wealth alone, they were exchanged for firewood, grain, medicine, and tools a village could not make. When a trader didn't return, mourning was quiet. Often, it was delayed. Families waited weeks before assuming death. Bodies, when found, were burned or buried shallow, sometimes with a portion of their undelivered goods. Some communities left a carved token at the site, a marked stake, a runestone, or a piece of cord tied to a tree, not as a warning but as a memory. The route, after all, would be used again. Frozen compacts and quiet trust. Interestingly, winter trade often required more trust than trade in warmer seasons. Formal agreements, contracts, weights, and measures were difficult to maintain in frostbitten negotiations. Scales froze, ink clotted, so deals were made with handshakes, shared meals, and spoken oaths. Honor meant everything. A trader who cheated another would find himself unwelcome for years, perhaps longer. Goods were sometimes left in drop points, pre-agreed locations, where one party left a bundle in exchange for another. These silent exchanges, repeated over seasons, reflected a remarkable social contract. Winter made enforcement difficult, so integrity filled the gap. There was, after all, no point in cheating a man if it meant freezing alone next year. And so they kept moving through snow that could bury a house, across rivers that whispered danger, between towns that waited in silence. Traders who survived earned little glory. No sagas were written about the man who brought beeswax to a midwife, or the woman who traded felt for dried meat, but their work mattered. They stitched winter together, one sled, one ski, one brittle bridge at a time. Yet there's still one piece of this story missing. When spring came and the ice cracked open, what did these journeys leave behind? How did frozen trade routes shape the towns, the customs, and the maps of the Viking world? The snow begins to retreat. Ice on the rivers darkens, softens, and splits. What was once a smooth, hard road now hisses and groans under the sun. Runners no longer glide. Sleds are dragged over slush and puddle. The once firm crust of the trail gives way to mud and rot. spring has come. But winter leaves behind more than frozen feet and fire-warmed hands. It leaves roots, habits, settlements, expectations. Over time, the once temporary trails carved into snow became something more a seasonal infrastructure of the Viking world. Though the snow melted, the memory of movement endured. Seasonal roads become permanent paths. Viking communities often traced the same winter routes year after year. They became more than temporary, they became traditional. In time, these paths were formalized into roads and trade corridors, forming the skeleton of internal Scandinavian trade. Settlements that once served as waypoints, small shelters, or lone farmsteads grew into permanent trading posts. Towns like Hedeby, Koppang, and Birka started as seasonal hubs, where winter goods passed through, then grew into year-round centers of commerce. Snow routes followed logic: elevation, access to water, shelter, and gentle slopes. When the thaw came, traders and farmers walked those same paths again, now in boots instead of skis. In this way, winter routes shaped summer roads, and thus, geography became behavior. You might not see the trail in the grass, but the generations remembered. Winter goods, spring markets. The goods carried on frozen roads often dictated what was available in the first spring markets. Fur and tanned hides, preserved in winter, would be sold or traded before the warm air brought insects and rot. Salted fish and dried meat, transported across snow, became springtime staples when fresh food was still scarce. Iron tools, moved inland during the frozen months, were bought by farmers preparing fields for planting. Medicinal herbs, preserved from the summer before and traded in deepest winter, were now dispensed to treat lingering illness. In some communities, spring fairs were timed to coincide with the arrival of the last winter traders. These fairs were often modest tables of goods laid out near a longhouse or along a riverbank, but they marked the transition of seasons. The winter had passed, the world was softening, but before the green returned there was business to finish. And so the legacy of winter lived on, not in snow, but in exchange. How winter trade shaped culture. These winter routes did more than move goods. They moved ideas, customs, and language. A man from the coast brought not only dried cod, but a new song he heard from a Danish skald. A woman returning from inland brought back a spindle pattern she saw stitched into a trader's pouch. A child might learn a foreign word from a man who had come from beyond the fjord. These were subtle exchanges, quiet, embedded in daily life, but over time they mattered. Inland Norse communities adopted coastal recipes, fermenting fish with herbs not native to their soil. Mountain villages began wearing fur combinations inspired by traders from Sami lands. Stories blended, beliefs overlapped, and dialects shifted, all carried on sleds and skis. Even religion traveled on these routes. Before Christianity arrived formally in Scandinavia, winter traders often brought tales of southern gods, crosses on cords, or Latin words misremembered. Paganism did not vanish overnight, but its borders were softened by movement. Winter roads were not just trade corridors, they were arteries of change. Myths, memory, and the snow that stayed. Over generations, tales of winter trade routes became wrapped in folklore. Some stories warned of ghost traders, forever crossing the snow, dragging empty sleds under moonlight. Others spoke of white paths, legendary shortcuts across frozen lakes that no longer existed. In spring, parents pointed to patches of grass and told children, "That's where old Gunnar broke through the ice and never came back. Step lightly." Many of these stories had a basis in truth: collapsed crossings, lost caravans, silent forests. But they also served a purpose. They preserved memory, ensuring the lessons of winter were never forgotten, even when green returned. Some trails, never used in summer, were still named and marked. Runed stones or carved wooden markers stood in clearings, not as graves, but as waypoints, a reminder that someone passed this way and might again. Even centuries later, medieval maps of Scandinavia referenced winter ways alongside roads and rivers. Though seasonal, they were real. Climate collapse and the end of some roads. But not all of these routes endured. In the centuries following the Viking Age, climate shifted. The medieval warm period brought milder winters. Snow came later, melted sooner. Rivers didn't freeze the same. Some sled paths became marshes again, impassable. Trade adapted, moving toward permanent harbors, ships, and larger towns. What had once been roots of resilience were now relics of a colder time. Still, in some regions, especially in northern Sweden, Norway, and Finland, traditional winter trade routes persisted into the 19th century, carried on by Sami traders and isolated farming communities. In these places, the sled remained a daily tool, and skis were not for sport but survival. The memory of the frozen road was never truly lost. So as spring birds return and the ice retreats to the shadowed corners of the forest, you might ask, where did these winter roads really lead? To towns, yes, to trade, to survival, but also to connection. In a world of long darkness and quiet snow, it was the act of moving, of carrying something useful across danger that made one part of something larger. And perhaps that's the truest legacy of the Viking winter trade routes. Not the goods they moved, but the spaces they filled between silence and civilization. How many of those paths still lie beneath the forests today, forgotten but once vital, waiting for snow to uncover them once more? Story 4. The smoke hole above fire, ventilation, and the scent of survival. You are lying on your back, staring upward from a straw-covered bench in the longhouse. Above you, thin beams crisscross the smoky air. Shadows flicker on the soot-stained rafters. A curl of smoke rises lazily from the central hearth, wavering as it finds the only escape route, a single, narrow hole cut into the thatched roof. This smoke hole, so small, so easy to overlook, is your second fire. The first, the hearth, keeps you warm. The second, this carefully placed ventilation opening, keeps you alive. This is the story of the smoke hole above, and why its quiet, invisible labor made winter survival possible in the Viking world. The design of the longhouse roof. Viking longhouses varied in length and construction, but their roofs were almost universally steep-pitched and covered with thatch, sod, or turf. These materials insulated well, but didn't easily allow for controlled openings. Cutting a hole into such a roof required precision. It was typically placed directly above the central hearth, aligned with the ridge line of the roof. Sometimes it was no larger than a helmet. Others were shaped like narrow slits longer, to accommodate larger fires. The exact shape and placement depended on local building practices and weather conditions. To prevent rain and snow from falling directly into the fire, many smoke holes had simple, angled covers, movable wooden slats, stone slabs, or even horn plates that could be adjusted with poles from inside. In wealthier homes, there may have been a cowl or hood, primitive but functional, redirecting airflow upward while blocking precipitation. But what mattered more than construction was the balance of airflow. Too small and the smoke lingered, causing coughing, eye irritation, and even death from long-term inhalation. Too large, and heat escaped, making the firework harder and the home colder. This dance between fire, heat, and air was delicate. The smoke hole was not just a vent, it was a lung, allowing the house to breathe. Living with smoke. You might think the ideal would be to remove all smoke from the longhouse, but the Vikings knew better. Some smoke was desirable. It helped preserve meat and fish hung in rafters. It deterred insects. It prevented mold and rot in the wooden beams. It seasoned the wood and cured leather items stored overhead. And perhaps most importantly, smoke acted as a filter for indoor air. Without it, cold air seeped in at floor level, carrying damp and disease. The thin layer of smoke hovering above head height created a thermal barrier. It also encouraged people to live lower seated, hunched, and wrapped in layers conserving body heat. That said, living in smoke was not easy. Eyes burned, children cried, elderly people often developed chronic coughs. Those with lung ailments sat near the floor, beneath the densest part of the haze. Bedding was hung to dry higher up in the rafters, smoked daily by default. The smell of charred peat, ash, and fat-soaked wood was ever present. Still, no one questioned the smoke's presence. It was simply part of winter, part of warmth, part of being inside. And when you left the longhouse, you carried its scent with you. Ventilation as survival. Ventilation was not a luxury, it was a tool. In the Viking longhouse, there were no chimneys. The central fire sat on packed earth or stone, and smoke rose directly into the room. The smoke hole was the only route out. To enhance airflow, builders included cracks along the eaves or small gaps in the roof seams. These were not mistakes, they were intentional. A well-designed longhouse used the principle of convection. Hot air rises. Cold air enters through gaps near the base of the walls. As the fire burned, it drew in oxygen and pushed hot air upward, forcing smoke out through the roof. This upward draft also helped keep the fire burning more cleanly, reducing soot. But in winter, this balance was harder to maintain. Wind, snow accumulation, and extreme cold could reverse airflow. Smoke would press downward, suffocating the room. That's why the smoke hole often had adjustable features, allowing the opening to be narrowed or widened as needed. Household members learned to read the smoke. If it pooled low, the fire was smoldering poorly, often due to damp wood. If it fled too quickly, heat was escaping, and the house grew cold. Sometimes, snow covered the smoke hole entirely, and someone would have to climb onto the roof to clear it, risky work on icy beams. A well-kept smoke hole meant warmth, health, and comfort. A neglected one meant suffocation. Firelight and domestic rhythm. The shape and movement of smoke also shaped the rhythm of life. The hearth was rarely a roaring fire. It was carefully tended, maintained at a steady glow. Too much fire meant smoke billowed and filled the room. Too little and heat dropped. So the fire was fed slowly, thoughtfully, with split wood, dried dung, or peat. Cooking depended on this balance. Pots hung from iron hooks or stood on flat stones. Ashes were banked around root vegetables to bake them. Smoke not only flavored the food, it preserved it. Children were taught not to run near the fire, not just because of danger, but because a sudden gust or movement could stir ash into the air, disrupt the smoke's upward drift, and cause smoke swirl, which stung the eyes and disrupted the delicate equilibrium of the room. When the fire was fed or adjusted, others paused what they were doing. It was not just a physical act, but a communal moment, like tending to a shared heartbeat. The smoke hole above may have been out of sight, but it was never out of mind. And so, as you lie beneath the rafters, watching the soft spiral of smoke vanish through the hole above, consider its quiet, constant labor. It removes just enough to keep you breathing. It keeps just enough to keep you warm. But what happened when that balance failed? What are the times when the smoke didn't rise, when the air grew thick, when even sleep became dangerous? What did the Vikings do when their breath turned heavy in their lungs, and the fire itself began to poison the air it once warmed? The smoke is hanging lower tonight. You notice it immediately, the way it stings your eyes when you shift your blanket, the way the baby coughs more than usual, the way the dog has retreated to the farthest, coldest end of the longhouse. Something's not right. You glance upward. The smoke hole above, once your quiet protector, now seems to struggle. Perhaps the wind has shifted. Perhaps the snow has built too high on the roof. Perhaps the air is simply too heavy to lift the smoke. Whatever the reason, the air is wrong. And when the air goes wrong, everything changes. The risk of poor ventilation. Viking homes, especially during the long winters, walked a razor-thin line between warmth and suffocation. The very design that held in heat-thick turf roofs, sealed walls, packed earth floors also risked trapping smoke when the balance of air circulation failed. In most longhouses, there were no windows, and doors were closed tightly to preserve heat. The only consistent air passage was the small smoke hole above. If this became clogged with snow, blocked by debris, or poorly adjusted, smoke would build rapidly. Symptoms appeared slowly. A constant tickle in the throat, irritated eyes, shallow breathing, a sudden silence among children or elders. In extreme cases, carbon monoxide, a danger they didn't understand but experienced nonetheless, caused confusion, headaches, and in rare but tragic instances, death during sleep. Victims would simply never wake up. While not a common occurrence, such deaths were remembered and stories were passed on. Sagas occasionally include mysterious mentions of whole households found dead with the hearth still warm, the fire burned down low, and no signs of violence. These were not ghosts or curses. They were victims of air turned against them. Midwinter maintenance, climbing the roof. Clearing the smoke hole in winter was no easy task. In heavy snowfall, the roof could become buried under drifts, especially in regions where turf roofing allowed snow to collect deeply without sliding off. The job fell to the nimble or the expendable, often a young man or boy, bundled in fur, sent up with a short-handled shovel or pole. Climbing a snow-covered roof was dangerous. Falls were common, and injuries serious. A broken arm in winter meant months of limited work and heavy burden on the rest of the household. But it had to be done. Once atop the roof, the climber would clear away packed snow from the smoke hole and check for damage to its covering, be it a wooden cowl, slab, or even layered thatch. If repairs were needed, they were done on the spot, with numbed fingers and frostbitten caution. Sometimes, a temporary chimney was fashioned out of stacked stones or clay-lined baskets, giving the smoke a higher escape point above wind eddies. But most families relied on simpler fixes, shifting covers, changing the firewood, or adjusting the hearth's layout. It was a delicate, ongoing act of calibration, and failure was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Fuel and smoke quality. Not all fires produced the same smoke. Damp wood created thick, choking smoke that hung low and clung to clothing and walls. It was sometimes unavoidable, especially during long winters when properly dried wood ran low. In desperation, even green wood was burned. Logs felled too recently to burn cleanly, hissing and spitting as they dried in the hearth. Peat and dried dung, common alternative fuels, also produced heavy smoke with a sour, cloying smell. Peat smoke, while effective for preserving meat, was notorious for coating the inside of the longhouse with a greasy soot. Over time, this blackened the rafters and flavored food with a bitterness that no amount of herbs could cover. To improve smoke quality, families sometimes mixed fuel types, layering dry birch bark under peat or alternating wood with dung. This required knowledge and judgment. Too much of one and the fire burned out. Too much of another and the air became unbreathable. Firekeeping was a skill, a domestic art passed down and practiced daily. Daily work around smoke. Nearly every task within the Viking longhouse happened in or near the smoke. Cooking, meals were prepared directly over the hearth. People leaned into smoke daily to stir porridge, flip flatbreads, or ladle broth. Preserving, fish and meat were hung on racks high above the fire, where the smoke curled upward to dry and flavor them. Crafting, leather, cloth, and even tools were stored in rafters to prevent mold and hardening, softened daily by smoke's steady warmth. Childcare, infants were kept low and wrapped tightly, but mothers and grandmothers were always alert to the signs of too much smoke. A coughing baby was a warning sign one never ignored. People moved in rhythm with the fire, ducking under smoke, standing to warm themselves, crouching to breathe. It shaped their posture, habits, and speech. Shouting raised too much dust. Movement stirred ash. Everything was slower, softer. The smoke hole was their only relief. A clear draft meant comfort. A clogged one meant aching lungs and watery eyes. And still they endured. The smell of survival. Everything smelled of smoke. Clothes, hair, blankets, tools, even bodies. The scent of the longhouse lingered on those who left it, a perfume of pine ash, boiled broth, and burnt dung. Traders and travelers could often identify where someone came from based on the type of smoke they carried. Coastal homes burned driftwood and seaweed, lending a salty, resinous scent. Inland farms relied on birch and dung, producing a sharp, earthy tone. Mountain families favored peat and pine, yielding a thick, bitter smoke. It was not considered unpleasant. It was normal. The smell of smoke was the smell of not freezing to death, of having food, of being home. Over time, it became comforting. And yet, for all this familiarity, the risk never vanished. One shift in the wind, one night of too little care, and the very breath of life might turn to poison. So they watched the smoke, listened to it, adjusted the wood, cleared the hole, moved the bedding. And they passed on the knowledge not in written words, but in fire rituals, bedtime warnings, and the careful hands of the next firekeeper. Still, one can't help but wonder. How did the smoke shape the very walls themselves? What became of a home soaked in soot and ash, year after year, generation after generation? Smoke is not invisible. You see it rise and vanish. Yes, but it leaves fingerprints. The rafters above your head, once pale with fresh-hewn pine, are now dark and slick with soot. The stone hearth is cracked, worn smooth in places where pots have rocked for years. Even the thatch and turf of the roof carries a scent so deeply embedded that no storm could wash it out. This is the final truth of Viking winter survival. The smoke stayed. It stayed in the house, the bones of the building, the grain of the wood. It shaped how longhouses were built, rebuilt, and remembered. Because once the fire burns long enough, it becomes part of the house itself. How smoke aged the Viking home. A typical longhouse might stand for 30 to 50 years, sometimes more if well maintained. But few survived that long without accumulated damage from smoke. Wooden beams, especially near the roof, absorbed years of oily soot. This black layer sometimes hardened into a crust, protecting the wood underneath from rot but making it brittle and vulnerable to sudden fracture. Walls of wattle and daub absorbed smoke unevenly. In some homes, outlines of hanging meat or pots are visible in the discoloration, a kind of living archive of daily life. Thatched roofing, meant to shed rain and snow, also held smoke close. Over time, the smoke trapped in thatch and turf mixed with moisture, creating a dense, musty smell that clung even in summer. But this residue wasn't just cosmetic. It altered how the building behaved. In extreme cold, blackened surfaces absorbed more heat during daylight hours, slightly warming interior air. Some households leaned into this, darkening the smoke hole frame with soot intentionally to speed melting in late winter. Insects avoided heavily smoked beams, reducing infestations. Leather and cloth stored in rafters didn't mold as quickly. Still, there was a tipping point. Eventually, too much smoke weakened the structure. When beams sagged and walls crumbled, homes were abandoned not because of external damage, but because of internal accumulation. The fire that had protected them had also, slowly, digested them. Moving out, building again. When a longhouse aged beyond repair, the family faced a decision: renovate or relocate. Renovating meant stripping and replacing roof sections, cleaning beams with blades or abrasives, and perhaps redesigning the smoke hole altogether. This was labor-intensive and often done during summer, when resources were available. But sometimes, it was easier to build a new house nearby. Abandoned longhouses were not left to rot. Wood was salvaged, Ashes were spread in fields as fertilizer. Roof sod was reused in new construction, and blackened timbers, if not fit for support, were cut into planks or used for fencing. Nothing was wasted. The new longhouse often kept the old hearth stones moved and arranged in the same layout, preserving the memory of the fire. In this way, smoke holes shifted location, but the fire remained at the center. New smoke holes might be placed slightly differently based on the lessons of the last home hire, angled differently, or protected with new materials. Some families tried adding side vents or double smoke holes, though these experiments often reverted back to traditional methods. Change came slowly in a world where survival meant repeating what had worked before. The soot archive, what archaeology tells us. Centuries later, the smoke still speaks. Modern archaeologists uncover longhouse sites with layers of soot and ash several centimeters thick. These layers, found between collapsed roof beams and beneath hearth stones, provide a surprisingly detailed record of Norse domestic life. Pollen and charred plant matter tell us what was burned. Microscopic ash patterns show where meat hung or herbs dried. Traces of animal fat reveal what was cooked and perhaps who lived there, based on diet. Even soot-covered beams preserved in boggy soil or dry subarctic zones tell stories. The pattern of blackening shows whether the smoke hole worked well or not. Thick soot in corners, poor ventilation, uneven stains, possibly a broken cowl or shifted roofing. One Danish site revealed a collapsed longhouse where the rafters were blackened unevenly, suggesting a winter collapse during use. Nearby was a broken fire iron, snapped in two. Had someone tried to clear the smoke hole too late? We'll never know for sure. But the evidence is clear. Smoke shaped everything from where people slept to how they built, how long they stayed, and even how they remembered their dead. Smoke in ceremony and memory. The longhouse was not just a home, it was the setting for rites of passage, and smoke was always present. Births were attended beside the fire, where warmth and protection made the hearth a sacred space. Funerals sometimes involved burning the possessions of the dead smoke, carrying their essence skyward. Feasts and oaths were taken with smoke curling into the beams, mingling with song and drink. In Norse cosmology, smoke connected worlds. It rose from fire to sky, from Midgard, the realm of humans, toward Asgard, the realm of the gods. Some believed that the smoke hole was a passage not just for air, but for spirits. It was the only part of the house that directly touched the open sky. Closing the smoke hole for good weather due to abandonment or ritual was a solemn act. In some rare cases, a symbolic final fire was burned, then smothered with the smoke hole sealed by stone or turf. A way of saying, this fire has ended. Others simply let the last embers die out and walked away, the smoke dispersing into the morning air without ceremony. But always the fire was remembered. Today those homes are gone. The smoke holes have long since collapsed, their angles forgot, their beams rotted or buried. But if you find yourself standing in the ruins of a Viking longhouse stone hearth in the center, scorched earth underfoot, you might look upward and imagine a column of smoke rising slowly, a hole in the roof carved just so, and beneath it, a life lived by firelight, measured not in years but in ash and breath. How many lives were shaped by a single curl of smoke, and how many forgotten, their names rising with it, never written but remembered in soot. Story 5. Ale, mead, and fermented shark, preserving food and sanity. The cold presses in. The sun barely rises. Outside, the snow has swallowed the fields, the paths, and the hills. Inside the longhouse, it's warm enough, but you've felt the hunger creeping in. The fresh meat is long gone. The bread, grown dense and dry. And so now, in these deep midwinter months, you turn to what remains. A clay jug, stoppered with wax and smelling faintly of honey. A skin of barley beer, clouded and sour. A bowl of preserved fish unidentifiable at a glance, but pungent in a way that tells you it hasn't gone bad, just very, very right. This is not feast food, it's fermented survival. And in the Viking Age, fermentation wasn't just a technique, it was a philosophy. One that spoke of patience, transformation, and the fine line between rot and nourishment. Let's begin with the most widely shared product of this cold chemistry, the brews. Ale, the daily drink. Unlike modern beer, Viking ale was not bottled, pasteurized, or carbonated. It was home brewed, cloudy, low in alcohol, and importantly safe to drink when water was not. Grain was soaked, sprouted, dried, and mashed. Barley was the standard, though oats and rye were used when available. The mash was heated with water in large cauldrons, then strained through baskets or cloth. Yeast, often wild or reused from prior batches, did the rest, feeding on sugars, producing alcohol and transforming sweet grain water into a mildly intoxicating, calorie-rich beverage. Ale was consumed by everyone, including children. It was not considered a luxury or vice, but a nutritious necessity. It provided hydration, warmth, and a touch of pleasure in a long, monotonous winter. The residue from brewing, called dreest, was fed to animals or added to thick porridges. In some households, the spent grain was pressed into flat cakes, dried and eaten like bread during lean weeks. Brewing was often a woman's task, passed down through practice, not formula. Recipes were never written, only remembered. And winter was when the best ale was drunk because it kept. Mead, honey, and ritual. If ale was the everyday drink, mead was for special occasions. Made from honey, water, and wild yeast, mead took longer to ferment but lasted much longer in storage. It was stronger, sweeter, and more symbolic. It was consumed during blots, sacrificial feasts, weddings, funerals, and midwinter gatherings. Mead was thought to have magical qualities. In Norse myth, the mead of poetry granted wisdom and eloquence. Drinking mead was not just a pleasure, it was a ritual act, a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. In winter, mead was stored in sealed vessels, often horn, leather, or clay, kept cool and dark. Some households buried mead in snow or earth, returning to it only for sacred occasions. Flavors varied by region. Coastal mead might include sea herbs or briny water. Inland mead was flavored with juniper, bog myrtle, or birch sap. In richer homes, mead might be spiced with imported herbs, though these were rare. Drinking mead wasn't just about drunkenness. It was about storytelling, bonding, and remembering. When food ran low and spirits dipped, a single horn of mead might carry an entire family through an evening of darkness. But drink alone couldn't sustain the body. Food had to be preserved, and this is where the Viking genius for fermentation truly shone. Fermented fish, strong smell, stronger stomach. Enter the most infamous of all preserved Viking foods, fermented fish. Even today in Nordic countries, dishes like surströmming, fermented herring, or hakarl, fermented shark, are legacies of this tradition. In the Viking Age, such dishes weren't exotic, they were commonplace, especially during winter. How was it done? Fish were cleaned, layered in barrels or pits with salt if available, and left to ferment. In colder regions, snow and ice helped regulate the process. In others, fish were buried in the ground or packed with birch bark and moss. The result was not a preserved fish in the modern sense, but a completely transformed food. The flesh broke down. The flavor intensified. The smell could be unbearable to outsiders, but to those who relied on it, it was life in a bowl. Shark was particularly problematic. The meat of the Greenland shark is toxic when fresh, containing high levels of urea and trimethylamine oxide. To make it edible, it had to be fermented for weeks in gravel-covered pits, then hung to dry for several more. The result? Hakarl, a chewy, ammonia-rich meat eaten in small portions, often followed by a stiff drink. But not all fermented fish was so extreme. Dried and slightly soured cod, pickled herring, and brine trout were also common. These were added to stews, mashed into pastes, or eaten with cold porridge. They were not loved, but they were respected. Fermented fish was survival food, and in winter, survival was the only flavor that mattered. The quiet science of rot. What's remarkable about all this is that the Vikings, with no modern microbiology, developed complex fermentation systems through trial, error, and oral tradition. They understood which food soured safely, how long to bury a fish before it turned from food to poison, which containers wood, horn, bark best supported certain fermentation types, how snow and temperature affected the pace of rot. They knew when a smell meant the food was ready and when it meant it had gone too far. These skills were passed down like family stories. You didn't just eat the food, you remembered who taught you how to make it, who survived the bad batch, who got sick when they ignored the signs. It was a shared generational knowledge, honed not in laboratories, but in longhouses and coastal pits. In the deep heart of winter, Viking households didn't rely on fresh feasts. They relied on transformation of fish into flesh, grain into drink, honey into myth. But these foods did more than fill stomachs. They gave rhythm to long days. They preserved memories. And in their own pungent way, they preserved sanity, a reminder that flavor, however strange, still had a place in the cold. Still, we've only skimmed the surface. What happened when even the fermented food ran low? When the barrels were scraped clean and the jugs dry? What strategies did Vikings turn to at the bitter end of winter, when only hunger remained? The fire still burns low in the hearth, but the storeroom smells of nothing now. The barrels have been scraped. The fish pits are silent. The mead jugs are empty but for a sticky film that no one can reach with a finger. Outside, snow still covers the ground. Inside, the longhouse has grown quieter. This is the hunger time. In the Viking world, even the best prepared households could reach the end of their preserved stores before spring truly arrived. These final weeks of winter, late February into March, were the most perilous. Days grew longer, teasing thaw, but nothing grew yet. No fresh plants, no hunting, no fishing through ice unless the rivers were known and safe. And so, Vikings turned to the deep reserve strategies, the last layers of resilience. Stretching the unstretchable, thin gruel and bone broth. When fermented fish was gone and ale no longer flowed, families began to dilute. Porridge, once thick and filling, was stretched with water. The barley, oats, or rye were ground finer and finer, scraped from the bottom of sacks, mixed with ground bark or dried moss. Birch bark flour, though bland and fibrous, extended what little grain remained. It was not nourishing, but it filled the stomach for a while. Bone broth was made from the saved remnants of autumn slaughter. Bones, often already picked clean, were boiled for hours, sometimes days, in water with a few stray herbs or seaweed flakes if available. The resulting liquid was thin, oily, and often murky, but rich in gelatin and minerals. Even old shoes, made from tough hide, were sometimes boiled down into gelatinous sludge. In extreme cases, a grim but occasionally referenced practice in regions with long winters. These meals were not celebratory, they were functional. The use of animal fat and tallow. If any fat had been preserved, rendered from autumn pigs, or stored from fish, it was treated like gold. Tallow was added to porridges, smeared on bread, or eaten directly by those who needed it most. It was dense, slow-burning fuel for the body. In some homes, tallow candles were made edible by design, formed from clean fat and stored with herbs or dried fruit bits, so they could double as both light and emergency ration. Bear fat, when available, was prized for its richness and long shelf life, but it was rare and often hoarded. There are records, oral and archaeological, of winter balls, hardened lumps of tallow mixed with dried meat or grain, meant to be rationed, one bite per day, for the weakest members of the household. In those last weeks, fat meant survival. Warmth, energy, and hope bound into a handful of grease. Fermented vegetable pastes and root stores. While fish and meat often get the spotlight, many Viking families relied heavily on fermented vegetables, especially cabbage, turnips, onions, and leeks. Stored in earthen pits or clay jars, these vegetables soured slowly over months. A properly sealed jar of sauerkraut-like cabbage could last through March. The smell was sharp, the texture softened, but it was packed with nutrients, especially vitamin C, which staved off scurvy. Dried onion strands strung from rafters were chewed raw or rehydrated into stews. Turnips, if stored in soil-lined pits, might survive even the worst winter, though they often sprouted by late season, turning woody and bitter. These were still eaten. Some families created vegetable pastes, mashed turnip and leek with a bit of vinegar or sour whey that could be eaten cold or thinned into soup. These were pungent, acidic, and nourishing. They were often reserved for the young, the sick, or the elderly. The line between medicine and food blurred as scarcity grew. The dangers of desperation. When stores failed entirely, Vikings faced the same ancient demon that haunts every pre-industrial society: famine. In extreme cases, the historical record suggests animal feed was consumed, grain meant for sheep or cows. Moldy bread was scraped and eaten anyway. Shoe leather and hides were boiled for starch and protein. Old beer mash was dug up and reprocessed. Rats and mice were hunted and roasted over low flames. Most disturbing are the vague, whispering mentions in sagas and folk histories of cannibalism, always framed as punishment, desperation, or myth. Whether true or cautionary tales, these stories serve to mark the outer edge of hunger's grasp. These tales often involved exiles, those cast out in winter and forced to fend for themselves. It was said that those who survived too long alone in the snow had smoke in their eyes and meat behind their teeth, meaning they'd lived off something unspoken. But for most, the worst suffering came not from violence, but from quiet starvation. Lying on a bed of straw, turning over the same sour taste in your mouth, dreaming of bread while chewing nothing. Sharing the last meal with your family, knowing there would be no more tomorrow. Waking up or not waking up with your back to the hearth. Community response and redistribution. Yet not every household suffered equally. In some regions, communal redistribution helped balance the scales. Larger farms or wealthy families stored surplus and loaned out grain or fermented goods not out of charity, but as investment. Those who borrowed were expected to repay in labor, goods, or future harvest shares. Winter gatherings, while rare in the deepest cold, were sometimes called late in the season, ostensibly for religious or social reasons, but often serving as a way to quietly share what remained. A shared pot, a jug passed from hand to hand, stories traded for stew. This didn't erase inequality, but it showed that survival was often a shared burden, especially in smaller communities. When one family suffered, the others would remember, and when they later prospered, they might be asked to give in return. Memory was a kind of currency kept with the salt, the sour, and the smoke. By the time spring truly broke and the first green shoots pierced the frost, the household was thinner, the silence hung heavier, and yet somehow they had endured. The fermented jars were empty, the skins were drained, the fish pits lay dry. But the fire still burned, the children still played, and in the ashes of the last porridge pot, someone was already making plans for next winter's batch. Still, one question lingers like the last scent of mead on an empty horn. How did they celebrate survival? When the thaw came, what feasts, if any, marked the end of the hunger time? And what did those first fresh meals mean after months of salt, smoke, and sour? The earth softens, ice breaks apart in the streams, snow melts away from the doorposts, revealing damp, flattened grass and the scattered bones of winter's meals. You wake one morning, and for the first time in months, you smell something different in the air, not smoke, not fish, not sour cabbage, but soil. The hunger time is ending. And while food is still scarce, the shift has begun. The first green things appear. The last of the mead is uncorked. Fires are stoked for celebration, not just survival. This is the feast at the end of the hunger. The first fresh foods of spring. The Viking diet did not return to abundance all at once. The earliest foods to appear were not grand, but they were alive. Nettles, one of the first plants to grow in spring, were boiled and eaten as a tonic. They were rich in iron and vitamin C. Vikings believed nettle stew could strengthen blood after a long winter. Sorrel and dandelion leaves were gathered for greens, often mixed with last-season vinegar or whey to create sharp, cleansing salads. Wild onions and garlic, sprouting in sheltered forest areas, were dug up and added to broths that had grown thin and flavorless. Birch sap was collected by tapping trees with hollow bones or reeds. Slightly sweet, watery, and refreshing, it was considered medicinal. Fresh eggs from hens, which had ceased laying in the darkest months, returned slowly. The first egg of the season was sometimes boiled and shared among the family, a symbol of the new cycle beginning. None of these foods were filling on their own, but they represented a turning point, a return to growth. After months of eating the dead and the transformed fermented, dried, salted, the first raw green leaf was a shock to the tongue. It reminded the eater that life was still moving forward. The end of winter brew. Ale brewed at the end of winter was different. Grain was lower in quality, often mixed with bark flour, moss, or scraps from other batches, but it fermented quickly in the slightly warmer air. This was known as the thaw brew, sometimes flavored with whatever herbs remained, yarrow, juniper, or even smoked wood shavings from the hearth. It was often cloudy, sour, and weak, but it was fresh, and that mattered. Some communities held small feasts around this brew. It marked the point where stored supplies transitioned into gathered ones. The last of the tallow, the final jar of sour vegetables, the dregs of fermented shark, these were eaten not with dread, but with finality. We survived. Eat the rest. It was not a lavish meal. It was a symbolic one. And afterward, the brewing continued with newer grains, if any had been spared, and new hopes, thick as the foam rising in the pot. Communal feasting and quiet rituals. In many communities, spring feasts were small, local affairs, not grand festivals, but quiet renewals. A shared pot over the hearth, containing broth made from the last bones in the first greens. A horn of mead passed slowly, sipped rather than drained. A piece of hard bread softened in broth, broken and distributed among children first. Old songs sung in softer tones, not of battle or gods, but of land and sun and survival. If there was meat, perhaps a hare caught early, or a fish from a thawed stream, it was roasted whole and shared by all, regardless of rank or age. These early catches were not hoarded. They were gifts, not trophies. Some families built small altars of ash, laying a piece of dried meat or fermented fish upon it, as thanks to the land spirits who had not taken them. This was not done with grandeur. It was done with gratitude. You didn't boast that you made it. You whispered it with your mouth full. The taste of sanity restored. Food had never stopped. It had fermented, transformed, stretched thin. But now it returned to its original form, alive, immediate, and full of texture. And this had a profound effect on the Viking mind. Months of eating sour, salty, or soft foods had dulled the senses. People spoke of how flavors came back in spring. Even the act of chewing changed. Fresh greens and spring grains required more jaw strength than porridge or fermented paste. This shift in food mirrored a shift in behavior. Conversations lengthened. Games returned to the fire circle. People began sleeping a little less and rising a little earlier. Chores moved from maintenance to planning. The inside world opened to the outside again. Mead and ale, which in winter had dulled sorrow and past time, now sparked toasts to upcoming hunts, plantings, and voyages. A cup of beer in April was not the same as one in January. It was not survival, it was preparation. Sanity, frayed by months of isolation, darkness, and sameness, was stitched together again by flavor, community, and the unmistakable sense that life was moving forward. From preservation to abundance, the cyclical mindset. For the Vikings, time was not linear. It was seasonal, cyclical. Winter required hoarding, rationing, transforming, but spring demanded letting go. You ate the last sour fish to make room for fresh catch. You drank the last stale ale to prepare the next batch. You burned the last wood from the stack, not in fear, but in completion. There was no feast without the hunger that came before it. This mindset shaped how food was treated. Preserved foods were revered because they had kept you alive. Fresh foods were celebrated because they reminded you why you'd stayed alive. And so, as the snow vanished from the fields and the ground became soft beneath the soles of leather boots, the first true feast of the year was not measured in abundance, but in contrast. Not in how much you ate, but in how different it tasted from what came before. Thus ended the season of sour and smoke, not with fanfare, but with a slow exhale, a shared bowl, and the quiet, unspoken truth that would echo again in the next winter. We endured, and now we begin again. But one wonders, how did these cycles of feast and famine shape the people themselves? What did it mean, over generations, to live always between hunger and harvest? Story 6. Children of the Frost, Norse childhood in the winter months. The longhouse is dark except for the hearth. A child stirs beneath a pile of furs, eyes wide, breath visible in the morning air. Somewhere nearby, a baby whimpers. You hear the creak of a wooden cradle, the rustle of straw, and the low voice of a mother singing just loud enough to comfort, not enough to wake the rest. This is a Viking winter through the eyes of a child. They didn't write the sagas, they didn't lead the hunts, but they were there in every corner of the longhouse, curled by the fire, carried in slings, or pressed together on shared bedding. And their survival was neither guaranteed nor easy. To be a child in winter was to survive without power. Let us begin with birth itself. Birth in the cold. Viking children were often born in the early winter months, September through December, following the rhythms of seasonal conception. These births came just after harvest, when food was still relatively plentiful, but before the harshest cold set in. Births occurred in the longhouse, in the same living space as everyone else. There were no separate birthing chambers. Privacy was managed by curtains of wool, hung on wooden frames near the hearth. The mother was laid on straw and skins, supported by midwives, often older women with deep knowledge passed down through generations. The risks were high. Infection from unsanitary tools or bedding. Exposure to cold air and drafts. Malnutrition, if the mother's diet had been poor. A weak baby born in January faced worse odds than one born in October. In the deepest winter, even warming water for cleaning was a challenge. And yet infants were born and swaddled. They were given names, or sometimes left unnamed for a time, in case they did not survive. In some families, a baby might be called Bitlinger, a kind of placeholder name meaning little bite or small one. Swaddling and sleeping. To protect them from the cold, infants were tightly swaddled in wool and fur, wrapped head to toe with only their faces showing. The swaddling served several purposes. Insulation, layering fabric and skin against the cold. Calming, keeping the child from waking themselves. Ease of carrying, as bobbies could be tied or slung to a parent's body. Cradles were simple wooden troughs or woven baskets lined with straw, moss, or wool. Sometimes, The cradle was placed on a hanging frame so it could swing near the fire. Others were set near animals for warmth. Children often shared bedding with siblings or slept with their parents. Proximity to body heat was critical. A child sleeping too far from warmth risked frostbite or worse. Fires were never allowed to die entirely. Even at night, embers were banked carefully. A mother would wake in the dark to stir the fire not just for light or cooking, but to ensure her child did not freeze. Every night was a quiet calculation. Feeding through the freeze. Breastfeeding was the standard, but it was not always possible. If a mother died or was unable to feed, wet nurses were sometimes employed other women in the household or community who could share the task. Milk from animals, particularly goats or cows, was used carefully, often mixed with water or gruel, and fed with horn cups or soaked cloth. As infants grew, they were fed porridge, broth, or soft bread soaked in ale or milk. Food was chewed by adults before being offered to children too young to handle solids. A child's first winter meals were not gentle, they were functional, designed to keep them alive, not please the tongue. In lean winters, children were fed less than adults, especially if food was scarce. But they were not ignored. A family that lost its children had no future. Even in famine, children ate something. Learning to survive. As children grew, they were slowly integrated into the winter routines. Kindling gatherers. Even toddlers were taught to collect small sticks from the firewood pile. Wool pickers. Small hands were well suited for helping prepare wool for spinning. Water watchers. A child might be tasked with checking the snow melt bucket or fetching ice if it had been left out. Children were not idle. There were no toys in the modern sense, but they played with carved wood animals, bone figures, and small versions of adult tools. A child's knife blunted or broken was a common item by age 5 or 6. They learned songs to memorize work tasks, chants for spinning, folding cloth, or tending goats. Play was often disguised work, familiarizing children with the rhythms of labor from the safety of the hearth. And all the while they listened. They listened to stories told in winter, the longest season of storytelling. Stories in the smoke. Winter nights were long, and for children they were filled with tales. Not just heroic sagas, but cautionary tales. The child who wandered too far and was caught by a troll. The lazy boy who refused chores and was turned into a mouse by spirits. The girl who burned the bread and brought hunger upon her family. These were not bedtime stories meant to soothe. They were lessons, warnings wrapped in rhyme and rhythm. They taught survival through fear, wonder, and repetition. The smoke curling above the hearth carried memory as much as warmth. To be a child in winter was to absorb everything: heat, hunger, fear, love. To learn the house from the inside out, the fire from the skin inward. To grow slowly under layers of wool and stories. But winter could not always be kind. Illness, cold, and hunger claimed many before their 5th year. And yet some survived. Some grew older, stronger. Some would soon begin training with real tools, stepping beyond the hearth to gather wood or learn to trap. Still, one must ask, what happened when children ventured beyond the safety of the longhouse? How did they face the elements alone for the first time, and what dangers waited in the snow for a child too bold or too curious? The door opens just a crack. A gust of icy wind pushes in. A child wrapped in layers of wool and fur hesitates. The light outside is dim, the sky flat and gray. The snow is high but firm. A wooden bucket is pressed into their gloved hands. Go! And with that, the child takes their first steps into the Viking winter alone. It might only be to the stream, or the midden heap, or the goat shelter nearby, but to a small body, it is a vast and silent world. One filled with dangers and, more importantly, with expectation. Because in the Viking Age, children were trained to face the cold long before they were strong enough to master it. Rites of passage, informal but real. There was no single official moment when a child became useful. Rather, each winter layered new tasks, new tests, new trust. By age 5 or 6, a child was expected to dress themselves in wool and fur, walk short distances, alone often to fetch water or gather kindling, know how to keep their mittens dry and their boots tight, tend a small fire under supervision. The stakes were real. A forgotten water bucket might freeze. A dropped glove might lead to frostbite. These weren't punished cruelly, but they weren't ignored either. Consequences were teachers. The first chore done correctly without help, a fire lit. A task completed might be rewarded with praise, an extra bite of food, or permission to sit closer to the hearth. Failure, especially when careless, might mean a night further from the fire, or the task repeated before eating. But perhaps more important than success or failure was the lesson in observation. Children were taught to watch how adults moved, how the sky shifted, how smoke drifted, how snow packed or powdered. You didn't survive winter by being strong. You survived by noticing. Winter games with purpose. Of course, childhood included play, even in the coldest months. But Viking winter games often blurred the line between fun and training. Sled pulling. Children dragged makeshift sleds, often with siblings or bundles of sticks, mimicking trade work and learning balance. Snow tracking. Games were made of following animal tracks or those of older siblings, sharpening their eye for detail. Ice sliding. Skimming across frozen rivers taught coordination and what thin ice felt like beneath the foot. Mock hunts. Using carved wooden spears or sticks, children played at catching game, learning aim and cooperation. Even storytelling was interactive. Children were asked to remember details, to recite verses, or to solve riddles. Memory was as crucial as muscle. Winter games were survival drills in disguise, and through them, children learned confidence, not recklessness, but the deep kind that grows slowly, like fire from coals. Dangers beyond the hearth. Still, the outside world did not care about age. Frostbite was a constant threat. Children were especially vulnerable in their fingers, toes, noses, and ears. A single forgotten mitten, a loose bootlace, a tear in a wool tunic, these small lapses could mean lifelong damage. Wolves, though rarely attacking humans, were feared in remote areas. Tales of children snatched or stalked were part cautionary tale, part memory. Falls into snowdrifts or streams could be fatal. A child stepping on soft snow covering a buried ditch might vanish in seconds. Getting lost was the most common danger. Snow obscured paths, and children who strayed too far could become disoriented in minutes. For this reason, early independence was incremental. The first solo trip was to the door of the goat pen, the next to the midden heap, then to the nearby path, then perhaps the next homestead. Each task prepared the body and mind for longer distances. And older siblings played a vital role. Paired responsibility meant one child watched the other. A 10-year-old might be in charge of a 6-year-old. This wasn't optional. It was a matter of life and death. The fear of losing a child in winter was real and ever present. The fire might keep them warm, but it couldn't find them in the snow. Children's work in the household economy. In winter, children contributed tangibly to the household's survival. Wool processing. Children helped card wool, tease it into bundles for spinning, or turn the wheel under the guidance of mothers and grandmothers. Fire maintenance. The youngest might be tasked with feeding kindling into the hearth, watching the embers and stirring ashes. Animal care. Feeding chickens, gathering stray hay, or brushing frost from goat coats were daily chores for smaller hands. Food preparation. Crushing dried herbs, mashing cooked turnips, or mixing softened fish paste, these were not glamorous jobs, but essential ones. Fermentation tasks. Some older children helped seal mead vessels, check fish pits for rot, or fetch the last jars of pickled vegetables. Nothing went to waste, including time. And though childhood was short, it was not without value. Children were seen as investments, future workers, future warriors, future mothers and fathers. Their labor was light, but their learning was constant. And as the weeks passed and the chores repeated, the snow outside began to shift. Sunlight grew stronger, ice melted from the edges of the eaves, and the children noticed. They always noticed. In these final weeks of winter, Viking children stood at a threshold. No longer babes to be carried, not yet adults to bear burdens, but walking into the cold with tasks in hand, fear in their bellies, and lessons beneath their boots. Still, a question lingers by the fire. What became of the children who were old enough to question their world? How did they understand gods, spirits, and the mysteries of winter when even the adults offered no clear answers? The hearth crackles. The wind howls outside. A child sits cross-legged on a fur-covered bench watching the flames. Their hands are tucked inside their sleeves, their cheeks red from the cold. Around them, the longhouse murmurs low adult voices, snoring elders, the occasional clatter of a pot. But the child listens elsewhere. To the stories, to the gods, to the space between the dark and the dawn. In the Viking world, children were not sheltered from belief. They were steeped in it, not with books, not with sermons, but with sounds, symbols, and rituals passed from hand to hand like fire in a longhouse. And in winter, when death pressed closest, these beliefs sharpened like frost on a window. The gods of winter told, not taught. Children learned about the gods by hearing, not reading, by watching, not asking. They heard about Odin, who gave his eye for wisdom and wandered the world in disguise. Thor, whose hammer struck down giants and whose booming footsteps were said to echo in winter storms. Skadi, the goddess of snowshoes, and the mountains an icy figure of both beauty and threat. Hel, ruler of the underworld, whose name was whispered when illness took a child or elder in the coldest nights. But the stories weren't clean. They weren't lessons in the modern sense. They were ambiguous, filled with strange consequences, trickery, and unresolved fates. Children didn't ask, "Is this true?" They asked, "What does this mean for us?" Because in winter, belief was abstract, it was practical. If you heard a knocking in the woods, you didn't speak its name. If the fire cracked twice before bed, it meant someone was thinking of you or someone was about to die. If the bread rose well, the ancestors were pleased. Children weren't told what to believe. They were shown how to live with belief. Spirits, shadows, and ancestors. Every Viking household had spirits, landvitir, house spirits, husvitir, and the Disir, female ancestral beings believed to protect family lines. Children were taught not to spit in the fire, it offended the spirits. To greet the house with a touch or bow when returning from outside. That animals could speak on midwinter's night if you listened closely. These ideas didn't require full understanding. They became habits, a kind of emotional infrastructure that helped children explain the unexplainable. Why the fire died suddenly. Why a sibling didn't wake up. Why the snow fell heavier this year than last. In a time when death came often and early, belief gave children a scaffold for sorrow. They learned to mourn not with questions, but with ritual. Leaving a crust of bread by the hearth for lost souls. Lighting a single oil lamp and letting it burn through the night. Speaking the name of a sibling only once, then never again. These practices were quiet shields against the coldest truths. The role of storytelling, repetition, rhythm, and remembering. Winter storytelling was not just entertainment, it was a tool of memory. Children memorized genealogies going back generations. Kennings, poetic metaphors, used to describe gods and heroes. Proverbs and riddles that preserved community wisdom. A child might not understand a riddle's full meaning at age 7, but by 15, the layers would unfold. For example, what grows taller the more you take away? Answer: a snowdrift. Simple enough. But later in life, that same riddle might remind someone of loss, of endurance, of the way absence shapes life in subtle ways. Children became vessels of oral culture, not just because they were curious, but because they had to be. Every time an elder died, the chain of memory risked breaking. So children were trained to listen, repeat, remember. It wasn't romantic, it was survival. Coming to terms with death. No Viking child was fully protected from the knowledge of death. They saw livestock slaughtered for winter, siblings or neighbors buried in frozen earth, bones stacked or cleaned for tool making, mothers weeping quietly into blankets. But they also saw rituals, the lighting of lamps, the carving of runes, the feasting that followed funerals. To a child, death was not hidden, it was contextualized. You were told, they've gone to Hell's Hall, or he is with the ancestors. Not explained scientifically, but also not left void. Children sometimes built miniature cairns outside, mimicking burial mounds, or whispered prayers to their carved toy gods, or tried to dream of the dead, hopping to catch a final message. In this way, grief became ritualized play, and fear became familiarity. Winter was not just an external force, it lived in their bones, their games, their sleep. And through belief, it became something manageable. The return of light, noticed first by the young. Children noticed the lengthening days before anyone else. They pointed out the sunbeam that reached one plank further across the floor, the icicle that dripped a little earlier in the day, the warmth of the dog's fur when it slept near the door, not the fire. And in noticing, they reminded their families. Spring was coming. Belief wasn't just about gods or spirits. It was also about trusting the pattern, that every winter ended, that every thaw returned, that no matter how many were lost, some would remain. Children carried that belief instinctively until they were old enough to doubt it, and then old enough again to teach it to the next. And so, a child survived winter not just by eating, dressing, and working, but by believing, in whatever way made sense. In gods, in rituals, in repetition. In the fire that never quite died. Because even in the darkest months, they were never just learning chores. They were learning meaning. Still, one wonders, when these children grew up, what memories stayed with them most? The taste of sour porridge, the feel of snow underfoot, or the silence of a longhouse after a story ended and the fire faded, and they realized for the first time they were no longer afraid of the dark. Story 7. Sea ice and smoke, the perils of winter trade routes. The fjord is still, not calm, frozen. A thin mist hangs above the jagged surface, broken only where the braver currents still move. Longboats sit half buried in snow along the shore, their hulls rimmed with frost. The sails are stowed. The oars are stacked. The men stand quiet, bundled in cloaks stiff with cold. This is not the image most associate with Viking trade. But trade didn't stop in winter, it simply became harder, slower, riskier. And for some, the cold was not an obstacle, it was a calculated cost of doing business. Let us begin at the shoreline, where decisions were made in frozen breath and icebound ambition. The trade that couldn't wait. Despite the dangers, winter journeys were sometimes necessary. A late shipment of iron or whetstones from the interior needed to reach a coastal buyer. A ship returning from England was caught in storms and arrived months behind. A chieftain in a distant settlement required urgent deliveries, grain, salt, or messages. Seasonal goods like fermented fish or frozen whale, meat had to move before spoilage. In such cases, traders assessed conditions daily. Was the fjord frozen solid, or only around the edges? Could a path be broken through with poles and axes? Did smoke from the sea signal warmer waters beyond? If a route could be cleared, or if the sea remained partially open, then the journey was attempted, but only by those with something to lose and everything to gain. Winter ships, modified and maintained. Traditional Viking longships were built for speed and agility in summer seas. In winter, however, smaller vessels, sometimes with shallower keels and reinforced hulls, were favored. These ice-adapted boats, often used for local travel, had thickened sides to withstand bumping against ice floes, shorter frames, easier to pull over frozen sections, covered cargo areas to prevent goods from freezing solid. Crews prepped boats meticulously. Oarlocks were greased with animal fat to prevent freezing. Sails were kept furled, and covered wet canvas in freezing air could snap like glass. Ropes were checked for stiffness. Lines soaked in brine could freeze rigid. Even rudders were modified. In deep fjords prone to sudden freezing, a ship might carry a spare steering oar, in case the primary one shattered against submerged ice. The margin for error was razor thin. Reading the ice, an ancient skill. Before setting out, captains spent hours, sometimes days, studying the sea ice. Vikings understood. Color: blue ice was thin and dangerous. White ice had more air and traction. Sound: ice that cracked sharply could still bear weight. Ice that groaned deeply was about to shift. Smoke over water. A visible mist often meant open water ahead, a sign that warmer currents, or danger, lay near. They listened to the gulls, watched the direction of frost on the trees, tested the shoreline with poles. Older sailors could predict whether a channel would remain passable for another day, or whether it might trap a ship until spring. These observations were passed down through practice, not writing. A young trader learned not from charts, but from watching his uncle probe ice with a spear, or listening to how a seasoned helmsman reacted when the ship bumped a floe. In winter, intuition was as valuable as iron. Crews and cold discipline. Winter trade crews were smaller, typically 6-10 men, including a helmsman, steersman, 2-3 oarsmen, a lookout, 1 or 2 guards if the journey passed through contested territory, the trader or merchant himself. They wore layers of wool and fur, mittens made of sealskin or felted wool, cloaks soaked in lanolin to repel moisture, boots lined with hay or moss. But even with these measures, hypothermia was a constant threat. A single misstep, a wave over the rail, a glove torn in the wrong place, and frostbite set in within minutes. Discipline was strict. Shifts at the oars rotated every 30 minutes. Fire was rarely lit aboard, too risky, near sails and ropes. Meals were sparse. Dried fish, flatbread, and hot broth from iron pots at stopovers. No one complained. Complaints wasted breath. And in the cold, breath was life. Coastal landmarks in a white world. Navigation in winter became visual and tactile. Familiar cliffs and rock formations were relied upon, though they looked different when snow covered. Carved runes on stones sometimes marked safe winter anchor points or paths between islands. Sound became a tool: waves, breaking against hidden ice, warned of submerged danger. In some areas, poles with carved animal heads were placed atop hills or cliffs, markers only visible from the sea, known only to local sailors. Yet storms could erase landmarks in hours. Fog could settle like a blanket, leaving the ship adrift among frozen teeth. And in those moments, even the best trader wondered, was this journey worth it? Was the promise of silver or salt stronger than the call of the hearth? They pushed forward anyway. Because in Viking society, survival depended not just on strength but on risk well calculated, and routes carved through ice by stubborn will. But as the cold deepened and ships disappeared into fog, the question remained. What happened when winter trade went wrong? When ships vanished or were trapped in ice? How did crews survive or not, and what traces did they leave behind? The fog rolls in thick. The sails hang useless. Oars slice through slush, not sea. Beneath the boat, ice creaks, not the surface ice, deep ice. Layered, shifting, waiting. A lookout signals from the bow. Nothing ahead but a narrowing channel flanked by ice crusts and cliffs. Turning back isn't safe, but neither is pressing forward. This is the moment where winter trade becomes winter survival. In Viking lore, many ships sailed out. Not all returned. Some were claimed by storms, others by the slow death of stillness. Frozen in place, miles from home, weeks from rescue. This is their story. Caught in the freeze, how ships became prisoners. When fjords or coastal channels froze unexpectedly, ships became trapped. Early signs included slush slowing oars or ice ringing the hull at night. If winds shifted and packed sea ice against shorelines, escape routes closed rapidly. In narrow channels, ice could form between cliffs in a matter of hours. Trapped crews faced a decision: abandon the ship and attempt to walk home or reach a settlement. Shelter in place, wintering aboard or building temporary camps. Neither choice was safe. Abandoning the ship meant trekking through snow with limited supplies, no maps, and ice-covered terrain. But remaining with the ship meant finding ways to survive in place, possibly for months. Improvised winter camps. When forced to stay, Viking crews transformed their vessels and surroundings into makeshift winter camps. Shelter. Sails were removed and used as tents or windbreaks. The hull was packed with moss and snow to insulate it from wind. If near shore, crews built lean-tos from driftwood, rocks, or even sections of the ship itself. Heat. Fires were built on flat stones, away from the boat, to avoid burning the only escape vessel. Heated stones were sometimes placed under cloaks or in bedding to prolong warmth overnight. In treeless areas, fire was conserved by burning dried seaweed, fish oil, or ship tar. Food. Rations were rationed. Most traders packed weeks of dried fish, barley, or flatbread, but not months. Frozen seawater was melted for drinking. Fishing holes were cut in nearby ice, slow, cold, and often fruitless. Some crews had livestock aboard: a goat, a few chickens, or a caged hawk meant for trade or sacrifice. These animals were eventually slaughtered for survival. If lucky, the crew could hunt seal or bird life. If very lucky, they were near a settlement, even if small or hostile. If unlucky, they waited. Mental toll: silence, ice, and the smell of smoke. Survival wasn't just physical. Mental deterioration was real, especially among small, isolated crews. Silence became oppressive. Without wind or waves, the world seemed to stop. Endless grayness blurred days and nights. The sun, when visible, skimmed the horizon like a half-remembered dream. Group tensions surfaced. Minor arguments over chores or food turned bitter. Some believed in sea spirits, creatures that tested a crew's patience, tempting madness. To maintain morale, captains imposed rituals. Rotating tasks every day: cook, lookout, firekeeper, snow gatherer. Telling stories by the fire, no matter how many times they'd been told. Carving runes into wood or bone, small prayers for endurance, memory, or protection. And always they watched the sky, hopping for melt. Abandoning the ship, the walk across ice. For some, food or fuel ran out. Then came the hardest choice. Abandoning the ship meant leaving behind trade goods, sometimes buried and marked, hopping for return. The security of shelter, the only place where they might be found. Survivors packed fur-lined boots, dried meat, knives, and flint. They walked by stars or coastal rocks or sheer instinct. Some traveled in pairs, others alone. In Icelandic sagas, There are passing mentions of such men. He walked out of the winter with nothing but frost and a tale. But most didn't leave records. Sometimes local settlements found cairns built hastily, or runes carved into trees. 5 men left, 2 remain, ice is too thick, farewell. Or, waited for thaw, waited too long. In spring they searched for the ships. Some were found half sunk, battered by shifting ice. Others never reappeared. Traders simply vanished, their routes marked only by stories passed from dock to dock. Why risk it? It's a fair question. Why sail at all in winter? The answer was rarely greed. More often, desperation, duty, or the simple rhythm of life in the north. A shipment meant the survival of a village. A message meant alliance or rescue. A missed window might delay a return journey by months. In Viking life, risk wasn't optional, it was assumed, and every sailor knew. To trade was to gamble. To survive winter was to endure the gamble's cost. So they carved their camps into the ice. They slept in sails. They told the same stories. Hopping repetition would warm what fire could not. And when spring came, some returned. They came back thinner, quieter, but with a boat still afloat. Still, one must ask, what happened when these traders finally returned home? How were they received by their communities, and what did they carry with them, beyond goods or scars? A shape appears on the horizon, first mistaken for driftwood or a bird's wing, but then a second and a third. By the time the hulls are visible, sails limp but upright, the entire village has gathered. They return slowly with cracked hands, salt-worn faces, and hulls lighter than they left with. Some ships carry half their crew, others none, and still others arrive alone, one man, rowing with a broken oar, eyes glassy, cloak frozen in place. This is not a triumphant return. It is a silent one. Because when Viking traders returned from winter voyages, they brought back more than goods. They brought back the knowledge of survival, of the cold beyond comfort, and the weight of what it cost. The first moments ashore. There were no horns or feasts, not immediately. The ship was pulled ashore. The crew collapsed or stood stiffly, waiting to be greeted. Family came first. Wives, children, brothers. Reunions were muted, not joyful. Survival dulled exuberance. Tears were common, but so was silence. Many just embraced, then turned back toward the fire. The cargo was checked next. Even in grief, life demanded inventory. Did the grain survive? Were the mead barrels intact? Did the buyer in the next village still want their promised iron? If trade goods were lost, reputations could suffer. But if the crew returned, and especially if others had not, their status increased, not as heroes but as endurers. Because in Viking society, survival was its own form of honor. Stories by the fire, what was told and what wasn't. In the days that followed, the tale unfolded. How the fjord iced over. How the crew slept on the sailcloth. Who went missing, and when they stopped speaking his name. Some stories were shared, often becoming local lore. Others were buried with the men who survived them. Vikings weren't boastful in the way modern myths suggest. They were pragmatic. They told what helped others plan, or what explained a scar. But details of fear, of frozen fingers, of how long it really took for someone to stop breathing, those were left unsaid. And yet, around fires in other villages, whispers began. Did you hear the men from Kaldafjord slept inside a dead whale for warmth? One crew burned the oars just to survive the last night. They left a message carved into a seal's skull, but it washed ashore unread. Whether true or not, these stories served a purpose. They reminded others, winter trade is not adventure, it is attrition. What changed at home? For those who returned, life resumed, but not exactly as before. Hands that had gripped frozen oars didn't always regain full movement. Appetites were strange men who had gone hungry, often preferred simpler food. Dreams were filled with ice, creaking wood and muffled screams. Yet many returned to expectation. A ship had to be repaired for spring. A debt from the last voyage had to be paid. A child born in the trader's absence now needed nomming. There was no rest for survivors, only the next season, the next voyage, the next uncertainty. But something subtle changed in those who came back from the frozen routes. They were more cautious or more withdrawn, quicker to anger or quieter at gatherings. Sometimes they became storytellers, other times they simply walked the shoreline alone. Because in surviving winter trade, they had passed through a kind of unmarked ritual abrush with death, followed by re-entry into a world that hadn't changed, but now looked different. The unseen cost of goods. When we think of Viking trade, we think of silver coins, beads, amber, and exotic goods carried from port to port. But behind every object there was often a journey through fog and frost, a fire lit with seaweed in a windbreak hut, a lost oarsman buried in an unmarked snowbank, a promise kept at terrible cost. The cost of goods in winter was not measured in weight or coin, but in fingers frostbitten, days gone hungry, stories half told, and people left behind on the ice. And every spring, when trade resumed, and the days grew long again, those who survived the winter remembered. Not all ships return. Not all sails rise again. But those who survive carry more than goods. They carry memory. With that, we leave the sea and return to shore. Another story carved into the quiet corners of history where frost, smoke, and silence shaped the past just as much as kings or conquest. Still, one question lingers. What of the traders who never came back? What clues did they leave behind, and how did their absence echo through the long winters that followed? Story 8. Winter's Law, Viking Justice in the Cold Months. The longhouse was silent but not still. Smoke curled upward from the hearth, stinging the eyes. Men sat close together, cloaks draped over their knees, breath visible in the firelight. At the center, a circle had been cleared. In it stood a man with a bleeding lip and another with a broken bootlace, both staring at the floor. Outside, snow drifted against the door. It was winter. And yet the law must be heard. Contrary to modern perception, Viking society was far from lawless. It was a world of deeply ingrained customs, memorized codes, and communal enforcement. In warmer months, disputes were settled at open-air assemblies, the thing held on grassy fields near rivers or at known gathering spots. But winter made such gatherings impossible. So justice moved indoors, not officially but practically, and the hearth became a court. Let us begin at the beginning, where law met snow, and survival pressed against principle. The thing that wasn't, winter's makeshift justice. The thing, or public assembly, was a central feature of Norse governance. Held regionally, these gatherings brought together farmers, jarls, chieftains, and freemen to hear disputes, settle grievances, and reaffirm social order. But in winter, travel was limited. Horses floundered in snow. Roads were impassable. Frozen rivers were risky crossings. Entire valleys became isolated pockets cut off for months. What then when a man stole grain, or refused to return a borrowed axe, or worse, committed violence? Winter justice had to adapt. Local chieftains or respected elders hosted hearth courts, small gatherings within a longhouse. These were not official things, but they carried communal authority. If the elder ruled, the community often abided. Disputes were heard by firelight, with testimony offered by witnesses present, and oaths sworn with a hand on steel or stone. Justice didn't stop, it simply became more intimate. Common winter disputes. The cold didn't pause human conflict. In some ways, it exacerbated it. Most winter cases were about resource disputes, who had rights to the last of the hay or the shared granary stores. tool theft or damage. Axes, saws, and knives were critical. Losing one could be a matter of life or death. Boundaries, snow-covered markers. Fences collapsed. Suddenly, someone's sheep were too close to someone else's plot. Accusations of hoarding. If one family seemed unusually well-fed, neighbors grew suspicious. And then there were the more serious crimes. Injury or murder during drunken fights or household feuds. Breaking of fosterage agreements, taking a foster child and failing to provide. Oath-breaking, especially in trade matters, carried over from autumn deals. Unlike the open-air things, these winter trials had no grand declarations, no ceremonial poles or banners, just men and sometimes women seated with their backs to the wall, fire between them, deciding what was fair. Oaths and objects, ritual in the cold. Winter trials were heavy with symbolism. With no formal court trappings, every object mattered. The hearthstone might serve as a sacred surface for oath-taking. A family sword could be placed between the disputing parties, a reminder of lineage and violence. A carved Thor's hammer amulet might be passed to swear truth upon, invoking divine punishment for lying. Testimony was weighed not just on content, but on character. A man known to have cheated during harvest might find his winter claims dismissed. Witnesses were vital. In winter, fewer people were available, but longhouses were full, and eyes saw everything. Often, servants or children were called upon to confirm what they heard through cracks in the wall or over the dinner table. Their words were not discounted, especially if others had heard the same. Punishments in a frozen world. Enforcement in winter required creativity. There were no jails, no formal prisons, but punishment had to be carried out often immediately for order to be preserved in tight quarters. Typical consequences included fines, payment in silver, goods, or food. A man might owe several pounds of dried fish or a side of pork. Public shamming. The offender stood outside the longhouse for hours, coatless, watched by all. Seating removal. Being barred from the hearth or mealtime gatherings was a powerful form of exile within community life. Temporary exile. In extreme cases, a man was made to live in the outbuilding or shed, with minimal supplies, a dangerous sentence in winter. For murder or grievous injury, wereguildman price compensation was still expected. If it couldn't be paid, vengeance might follow come spring. But the most feared winter punishment was Jalford, forced departure across the snowy hills. Few survived such exile alone. Justice and the shared roof. What made winter justice so delicate was proximity. Accuser and accused often lived in the same household. Elders might be related to both sides. Children heard every word. The goats even seemed to watch. This closeness required a quiet sort of justice, one that preserved survival above all. Disputes were settled quickly, before resentment festered. Apologies were not theatrical, they were practical, a means to get back to shared work. Victims sometimes dropped charges in exchange for extra labor or goods, not from forgiveness, but from necessity. In the longhouse, everyone depended on everyone else. And so, justice was less about punishment and more about preserving function. Even when tempers flared, the snow reminded all. You cannot survive alone. In the heart of winter, Viking justice was not cold, it was measured, pragmatic, and rooted in the rhythms of survival. It demanded memory, patience, and fire-like clarity. Still, one wonders, what happened when winter law failed, when violence erupted despite the oaths, or when vengeance refused to wait for spring? How did these tensions carry into the thawing world? The fire is out. Ash cools slowly in the hearth. Outside, a red stain darkens the snow, already beginning to freeze over. Inside the longhouse, no one speaks. They know what has happened. A quarrel unresolved. A grudge too heavy to survive the winter under the same roof. A man has died and now law has failed. For all its order and ritual, Viking justice had limits, especially in winter. When oaths were broken. Oaths were sacred in Norse culture, believed to carry weight not only in law, but in the eyes of the gods. Swearing falsely was said to invite the wrath of Odin or Thor, or worse, shame in the eyes of kin and community. But winter strained honesty. Hunger twisted intentions. Boredom inflamed grudges. And proximity made escape impossible. A man might promise to repay borrowed goods come spring, only to spend them early when his family starved. A boundary dispute settled in words might resurface the next time a sheep wandered across the invisible, snow-covered line. Sometimes the fire in the hearth couldn't hold back the fire in the heart. When oaths broke in winter, they often broke quietly, then violently. The rise of the blood feud. The most feared outcome of failed justice was the blood feud, a cycle of revenge killings between families that could last for generations. These feuds didn't always begin with dramatic events. Often, they started with an accidental death during a drunken brawl, a slighted insult that struck too close to pride, a mishandled ruling during a hearth court session. When someone died and compensation wasn't made or wasn't accepted, justice turned to personal revenge. In winter, this was especially dangerous. Snow-covered bodies and erased evidence. With only a few households within range, everyone knew everyone and no one could leave. Weapons were always nearby. Even fire-tending irons or wood-chopping axes became tools of violence. One saga mentions a feud that began over a missing spoon, which escalated until 3 farms burned and 9 men died, all before the spring thaw. Because winter gave no space for breathing, resentment was trapped like smoke beneath a snow-covered roof. The role of women in winter feuds. Women played complex roles in Viking justice, especially in winter. They were often key witnesses to disputes, as they worked closely in shared spaces. Mothers, wives, and daughters sometimes acted as peacekeepers, urging compromise or arranging compensation. But they could also inflame tensions, especially when they felt honor had been slighted. A well-known Icelandic proverb warns, "Beware the woman who binds wounds by night and unbinds peace by morning." Some women goaded their sons or husbands into vengeance, fearing that peace would bring shame. Others secretly arranged payments or apologies, hoping to end cycles of blood. And some, when the men would not act, took matters into their own hands. Murder in winter hidden in ice. Killing someone in winter was, paradoxically, both easier and riskier. Easier because snow-muffled footsteps and screams. Frozen ground preserved the body sometimes for months. Darkness came early and stayed long. Riskier because fewer people traveled, so when someone vanished, it was noticed quickly. Villages were isolated. No alibi was believable unless witnessed directly. Snow recorded footprints. In some cases, murderers confessed immediately, hopping to pay weregild and end the matter cleanly. But if the family of the slain refused compensation, it meant one thing: blood must answer blood. The weight of vengeance in the cold. Revenge was not always swift. In winter, travel was hard and tempers sometimes cooled. Some chose to delay revenge until spring, but that didn't ease the tension, it prolonged it. Men slept with axes nearby. Fires were kept burning all night, not just for warmth but for visibility. And all the while, rituals continued. Runes were carved for protection. Offerings were made to ancestors. Oaths were renewed or quietly broken. Communities knew that vengeance unresolved in winter often unleashed itself in spring. It became part of the rhythm. Snow melted, ice broke, and then the first axe fell. When law returned with the thaw, Come spring, official things resumed. Disputes long postponed were finally aired. Accusations were brought forth, not all of them recent. The scars of winter were on everyone's faces, not just from frostbite, but from tension, hunger, and loss. In these public assemblies, the stories of winter came to light. Who had died and how? Who had tried to keep the peace? Who had failed to pay or fled before judgment? Sometimes, justice caught up with those who had acted in winter's shadows. Other times, the evidence was lost beneath the snow, and the dead remained silent. And so, Viking law lived in two seasons. The summer of process and ceremony. The winter of compromise, desperation, and silence. Each shaped the other. Each reminded the community. Justice is not a season, it is a thread that must be pulled through all weathers, even when frayed. So what happened next? Did the return of the formal thing always restore peace, or did the grudges of winter simply hide beneath polite oaths? Could Viking justice truly contain the fire lit by cold isolation and shared roofs? The snow is melting. Water runs in thin, glistening lines down the hills. The rivers, once locked in place, surge and crash through their banks. Paths reappear, horses stamp and breathe in cold mist, and people begin to move again. It is spring, and with it comes the thing. But the thing this season feels heavier. People gather not just with complaints from new disputes, but with unfinished business from the winter past. Unpaid debts, unanswered deaths, unspoken tensions. For while winter forced a kind of justice born of necessity, spring demanded reckoning. The thing returns, a gathering of memory. Across the Norse world, regional assemblies began again once the snows melted. These were not simply court sessions, they were social, spiritual, and economic gatherings. Traders arrived with early season goods. Alliances were renewed. Marriages were proposed or finalized. Laws were recited aloud, often from memory. But most importantly, disputes were aired. Cases from winter were heard with special weight. Everyone knew that surviving a winter dispute, unresolved, left a mark. These matters were treated with a blend of formality and communal scrutiny. If a killing had occurred and weregild was unpaid, the family of the deceased could demand blood vengeance or force a ruling. If theft had gone unpunished during isolation, the wronged party might present evidence: a branded tool, a scar, a witness finally free to travel. If hearthcourt justice had failed or been ignored, the formal assembly could override prior decisions. In this way, the thing functioned as both court and catharsis. Public oaths, public peace. At these spring things, peace wasn't just hoped for, it was ritually renewed. Individuals who had quarreled in winter were sometimes brought before the assembly and made to clasp hands before witnesses. Oaths were restated not in secret but aloud, with community backing. In serious feuds, a neutral party might offer compensation or land to prevent further bloodshed. This wasn't always successful, but the thing was structured to make peace more attractive than vengeance. Public honor was restored through acknowledgement, not silence. Those who refused compromise risked losing face, support, or even being outlawed. In Viking law, to be declared utlagi, an outlaw meant losing legal protection. Anyone could harm you without consequence. In small communities, this was effectively a social death sentence. Better to settle, even if the wound still burned. The role of lawspeakers and elders. Each thing had a lawspeaker, a man tasked with memorizing and reciting the region's laws. His role in spring was critical. He reminded all of precedents from past winters. He ensured consistency between informal winter rulings and formal spring law. He navigated complicated overlaps, such as when two winter judgments conflicted. In practice, the lawspeaker served as both judge and memory, an anchor in a society where law was spoken, not written. In matters too personal or too political for open trial, elders sometimes gathered in small councils. Their wisdom was sought not for legal interpretation, but for social balance. They asked what outcome preserved the peace, what decision ensured the community would endure next winter. Because always, winter would return. Lessons learned from the cold. By summer, most winter conflicts had been settled or buried. But the lessons remained. Communities learned which households were prone to hoarding or quick to violence. Traders marked down those who reneged on winter debts. Women remembered which men had offered shelter, fairness, or cruelty during the lean months. These memories shaped future interactions. In a world without written records, reputation was currency. And so next winter, when the snows came again and travel ceased, justice would once more retreat to the hearth. But this time, perhaps, it would be better informed. Because last winter's disputes were this spring's stories. From cold justice to collective survival. What we learn from Viking winter justice is not just about law, it's about adaptation. How a society without centralized power still managed to maintain order. How communities valued harmony over punishment, especially when isolation made cooperation essential. And how justice was not always fair, but always functional. In many ways, Viking law was an agreement that survival mattered more than pride, and that sometimes it was better to sleep beside an enemy than die alone in the snow. So next time we imagine Viking justice, let us look not only to the thing stones and public speeches, but to the fire-lit rooms, the whispered oaths, the frost-covered axes, and the quiet forgiveness spoken over barley bread and smoke. Because that too was justice. And in winter, it was the kind that mattered most.